In February 2024, French President Emmanuel Macron issued a statement that shocked the world. After a meeting in Paris of over 20 European heads of state and other Western officials, Macron issued a stark warning to Vladimir Putin. "We will do everything needed so Russia cannot win the war." If that wasn't incendiary enough, in his next breath, the French leader openly discussed the possibility of deploying Western troops to fight in Ukraine. There's no consensus today to send in an official, endorsed manner troops on the ground, but in terms of dynamics, nothing can be ruled out. Putin's response was predictably furious. According to Al Jazeera, the Russian leader had this to say on the matter. The West has announced the possibility of sending Western military contingents to Ukraine. The consequences for possible interventionists will be way more tragic. Not for the first time in the last 2 years, the rest of the world has been left facing the very real possibility of a wider conflict that may have a nuclear conclusion. But what led us to this critical stage? If you were to take a step back and soberly assess the situation, it's easy to see why Putin was so riled by Macron's not-so-thinly veiled threats. After all, one of the main historical bones of contention for Moscow was NATO expansion into Central and Eastern Europe, most notably the establishment of a fully operational military base on Polish soil. Having been subjected to countless invasions and occupations throughout its colorful history, from Genghis Khan to Napoleon Bonaparte, Russia saw this as an act of aggression and a threat to its sovereignty. To put another great military-shaped fly into the ointment, 20,000 troops from 9 countries have recently participated in full-blown North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, exercises in Central or Eastern Europe. Where, exactly? You guessed it, northern Poland. Taking all of the above into account, how close are we to a Western troop deployment in the war in Ukraine? And would that inevitably lead to a global conflict, maybe even of World War III proportions? That's the question that we'll attempt to answer in this video. Before we begin, we must acknowledge that the mere presence of a relatively large number of US, French, and British troops in Poland could easily be interpreted as a hugely provocative act by Russia in itself. Granted, Western leaders have attempted to put a far more benign spin on the situation. Terms like testing the NATO alliance's deterrence and defense capabilities have been bandied around in the press. But because Macron has made such pointed statements of potential intent, it can easily be seen by some as adding kerosene to an already blazing fire. But what exactly were the troops doing there? Well, according to an in-depth report from Defense News, nothing more than standard military drills. Following deployment, the participating nations undertook many maneuvers, both on land and amphibious, the likes of which are seen in any training exercises conducted by any army in any part of the world. Tellingly, however, these drills included a challenging river crossing. As part of the Polish-led Dragon 24 military exercise, American, British, French, German, Spanish, Turkish, Slovenian, and Lithuanian soldiers traveled across a 320-meter section of the Vistula River. They chose this time of year to host this event, said Major General Cezary Wisniewski, a senior Polish military official, as the waterway can be difficult to navigate in early March. "We wanted the most challenging conditions. The water levels of the river are very high and the winds are usually strong." The crossing involved positioning floating bridges, which then had to be loaded with tanks to navigate from the opposite side of the bank and dock safely for the vehicles to disembark and continue with their military objectives. Furthermore, a simulated crisis included the movement of many personnel and combat vehicles across Polish territory. "The movement of troops is a crucial part of the exercise," said Wisniewski, "especially in a situation like today where we have large formations of troops involved, with 20,000 plus military personnel and 3,500 pieces of equipment." At this point, you would be forgiven for questioning the sheer numbers involved here, over 20,000 troops and 3,500 pieces of military hardware. More statement of intent than a standard military drill. Even the least cynical amongst you must find it hard not to class such a large-scale exercise as an act of intimidation. To others, it closely resembles a warm-up before the deployment of military personnel from NATO countries to Ukrainian territory, even if they wouldn't, at this stage, be taking an active role in combat operations. All of this was corroborated in a recent statement by the Polish Ministry of Defense. While the exercises are defensive and not directed against any state, they are deemed to be a demonstration of the ability to counter any aggressive policies and proactive activities of the Russian Federation. Another broadside in Moscow's direction, if ever there was one. But perhaps there is a deeper underlying symbolism involved here, one that goes further than the military exercises on Polish soil, for these drills took place only around 100 kilometers away from Poland's border with the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad on the Baltic Sea. And again, that is something that would be a huge cause of concern for a Moscow almost obsessively paranoid about any potential incursions into its territories. Now, this area, the Suwalki Gap, or Suwalki Corridor as it's sometimes referred to, has been of great historical importance for many years. Moreover, it acts as a choke point that could well play an incredibly vital role if Putin decides to escalate his military aims in Eastern and Central Europe. But where exactly is the Suwalki Gap, and why is it so important? The Suwalki Gap is an area around the border between Lithuania and Poland that's sparsely populated, to say the least. It represents the shortest path between Belarus and the aforementioned Russian exclave of Kaliningrad Oblast on the Polish side of the border. Named after the Polish town of Suwalki, this choke point has been of great strategic and military significance ever since Poland and the Baltic states joined NATO. The border between Poland and Lithuania was formed after the Suwalki Agreement of 1920, but it was of little importance in the interwar period, 1918 to 39. At the time, the Polish lands stretched farther northeast. During the Cold War, however, Lithuania was part of the Soviet Union, and Communist Poland was a member of the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact alliance. The eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact hardened borders that cut through the shortest land route between Kaliningrad, Russian territory isolated from the mainland, and Belarus, Russia's ally. From that geographical information alone, it's clear to see why the Suwalki Gap is seen as such a key location should the war take an unexpected turn. In fact, an article from Politico shortly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine went a step further, claiming that the area is the most dangerous place on Earth. Why? Well, Western military planners warn that the Suwalki Gap would likely be one of the Russian president's first targets, were he ever to choose to ramp up the war in Ukraine into a confrontation to end all confrontations with NATO. At present, all is quiet in the area, but for how long though? Ramunas Sepatuskas, commander of a local company of Lithuania's Riflemen's Union, a voluntary militia with roots stretching back more than a century, is monitoring the situation in the border region with growing unease and concern. For many, the Suwalki Gap is Lithuania's Achilles heel. Some think there's no point in attacking us, but it must be noted that this is a direct route to Kaliningrad, he said. If they're able to overcome Ukraine, it's possible that the next blow would fall here. And therein lies the rub, and perhaps a little more light on Macron's statements, as well as just why US, French, and British troops might just be ready to enter the fray in Ukraine. In February, Russia scored one of, if not the, biggest victories of the increasingly attritional conflict so far, the taking of the hugely important strategic Donbas city of Avdiivka. The fact that fighting, whether intermittent or heavy, has been raging since 2014 only underscores the significance of the win for Moscow. Even more worryingly, Ukrainian troops are running out of everything from effective radar equipment and military hardware to basic ammunition on the ground. But a restock of supplies is slow in coming, across the board. In an interview with CBS and published by The Hill in March 2024, the beleaguered Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky made the following statement: "We don't have rounds, artillery rounds. We don't know what will be tomorrow. That's why we have to prepare." Since the beginning of the conflict, Ukraine has received unprecedented levels of military aid. According to the Council on Foreign Relations from February 2024, the US alone has pledged over $75 billion so far. Naturally, at the start of the conflict, the political goodwill was there for all to see. Citizens in Western nations in particular were appalled at Putin's act of aggression and fully backed their government's actions. Now, over 2 years down the line, people have become increasingly war-weary, especially now they are being bombarded with images of Israel's brutal war with Hamas. And this has had an inevitable knock-on effect. Back in December 23, US President Joe Biden encountered incredible difficulties in getting approval for a new military aid package for Ukraine passed through Congress. In a report from the BBC, there was huge resistance from Senate Republicans to the new $61 billion package, despite an unnamed Ukrainian official stating that failure to secure more US aid would mean a very high possibility that the war would be lost to Russia. Of course, this is the outcome no one in the West wants to see, evidenced by Macron's comments quoted at the top of the video, but the plain facts of the conflict cannot be disputed. Ukraine has received huge military backing from the West, but it now looks as if the country is slowly but surely losing the war. So is the solution yet more funding, the transport of more military hardware, bigger and better rockets and guns, more support on the ground, and more economic sanctions against Russia? In an ideal world, perhaps that would be the easiest solution, all of the above. But no war can go on in perpetuity, just as no government, no matter how well-meaning or righteous the cause they champion, has unlimited coffers. Hence, Ukraine's main allies find themselves in an invidious position where direct action might be the only way to proceed. a point emphasized by Phillips O'Brien, Professor of Strategic Studies at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. The issue of sending European forces to help Ukraine was never one to be dismissed, he said. Europe is now faced with a terrible dilemma, watching Ukraine potentially run out of ammunition or stepping in and helping Ukraine more directly. Zelensky has hinted as much himself, warning that the war could escalate to Europe. The US is helping Ukraine and we are grateful for their support, but the United States don't have the war going on. But it can come to Europe and to the United States of America. It can come very quickly to Europe. But are the leaders of countries like the US, France, and Britain really ready to act? Do they genuinely fear that a Russian victory in Ukraine may be only the start of a wider conflict in Europe and beyond? And were the drills that took place in Poland back in March actually preparations for a special military operation of their own? If so, it brings us all the way back to the Suwalki Gap. As stated, it's the only way to get by road or rail from Poland and Central Europe to the Baltic states, which are arguably NATO's most exposed members. A Russian move to seize control of the corridor may seem beyond the realm of possibility at the present time, as it would explicitly involve an attack on NATO territory, automatically triggering a US military response. Why? Article 5 of the NATO Charter. The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. But will Putin be cowed by Article 5 in the way much of the world assumes? Will it continue to act as a deterrent when the stakes are so much higher now? That's a question that can't be answered at this stage, but considering the Russian leader's complete disregard for international law, it would pay for the West to prepare now for the worst-case scenarios. However, the sticking point seems to be the very real concerns that increased military assistance to Ukraine, meaning direct troop deployment of the kind Macron threatened in Paris back in February, might paint the West as co-combatants in the eyes of the international law Putin himself is so happy to flout. And there's no way that any Western government, be it Biden, Macron, or UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, could risk being cast as the aggressors. History would never forgive them. If they did proceed regardless, it might give Putin the excuse he needs, and probably wants, for lashing out and launching new military offensives of his own. Namely, the Kremlin may see an increased threat to Kaliningrad and seize the Suwalki corridor to create a land bridge to the exclave. Moreover, Kaliningrad is now home to substantial Russian combat forces, including the Russian Baltic Fleet, advanced air defenses, and mobile nuclear-capable Iskander-M missiles. For that reason, Russia is hugely sensitive to any threats, real or imagined or invented, to its control of the non-contiguous territory, and might risk escalation if it misinterpreted NATO's actions near Kaliningrad. Naturally, any attempt by Putin to seize the corridor would mean an attack on Lithuania or Poland, or both, and a direct war between NATO and Russia. And like we said, this would at best be strategically unwise and at worst a precursor to World War III. But time and time again, Putin has kept the West second-guessing. There's nothing to suggest that a potential conflict over the Suwalki Gap would be any different. For now, the world can only look on with bated breath. Make no mistake though, the clock is ticking. And perhaps the country looking most concernedly at the hands traversing that metaphorical clock face is, of course, Poland. In the 20th century, the Polish people suffered terribly at the hands of two of history's most brutal dictators. In one direction, they had Hitler's all-conquering Wehrmacht, in the other, Stalin's vengeful Red Army. One intent on invading and seizing power, the other to rape, pillage, and forcibly indoctrinate the populace with their communist ideology. Put quite simply, the country became one big battlefield, with its major towns and cities being reduced to nothing more than rubble in the process. Understandably, Warsaw never wanted to be in that position again. To protect itself going into the 21st century and beyond, Poland has built one of the most modern and best-equipped armies, not just in Europe, but the whole world. Indeed, the defense minister Mariusz Błaszczak claimed that his country would soon have the most powerful land forces in Europe. Many would argue that the country already has. At the time of the making of this video, Poland has more tanks and howitzers than Germany and is on course to have a much larger army, with a target of 300,000 troops by 2035, compared with Germany's current 170,000. In terms of troop numbers, the military is about 150,000 strong, with 30,000 belonging to a new territorial defense force set up in 2017. These consist of weekend soldiers who undergo 16 days of training, followed up by refresher courses. Initially sneered at, Ukraine's success in using mobile militia equipped with anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles now makes the idea seem much more sensible. The list could go on, and it's made Poland a powerful force to be reckoned with on the global stage. to the extent that a senior US Army official sees the country playing a crucial role in supporting Ukraine and in shoring up NATO defenses in the Baltics. Poland has become our most important partner in continental Europe. So, would Putin be willing to open up another military front and launch an all-out attack on a country with such fearsome military resources at its disposal and such powerful allies? The ramifications have already been set out in this video if the ultimate answer is none the clearer. To come full circle, Macron's threats of Western troop deployment were roundly criticized by the rest of the world. For some, they were unnecessarily aggressive. For others, reckless and ill-advised. Already, the situation in Ukraine is on a knife edge and tightrope combined. With Putin seemingly happy to play the long game now, what will ultimately happen in the short to medium term is difficult to predict. In recent interviews, Zelensky has said that he fully expects the Russians to launch another full-blown offensive in the spring, with May being the most likely date. Meanwhile, predictions coming out of Moscow, both from those opposed and those firmly behind Putin's leadership, suggest that the war could drag on for another 5 to 7 years. But maybe the key factor in both the short and longer term will be the outcome of the US presidential election in November 2024. If Donald Trump were to be re-elected, it could have disastrous ramifications for Kyiv. Whether that would mean a significant reduction in military aid or the end of all financial and military support altogether is yet to be seen. Back in 2023, when asked about the Ukraine conflict, Trump was in a conciliatory mood. "I know Zelensky very well, and I know Putin very well. I would tell Zelensky no more. You've got to make a deal. I would tell Putin, if you don't make a deal, we're going to give him, Zelensky, a lot." Since then, the former president's tone has changed. Worryingly, in a CNN report from March 24, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán is quoted as saying in an interview with M1 Broadcast, he, Trump, has a very clear vision. He says the following: first, he will not give a single penny for the Russo-Ukrainian war. That's why the war will end, because it's obvious that Ukraine cannot stand on its own 2 feet. If that transpires, then the whole nature of the war will, of course, be turned on its head. So perhaps the biggest question facing the likes of the US, France and Britain is just when exactly the time for procrastinating is over. To their credit, the governments of each of those countries took decisive action from the outset. They pledged huge amounts of money to bolster the Ukrainian war effort and implemented some of the harshest economic sanctions against Russia ever seen. But still, it hasn't been enough, not by a long shot. In addition to the significant military breakthroughs referenced earlier in the video, Putin has also managed to absorb the economic blows associated with the sanctions by exporting huge amounts of gas and oil to Asia, most notably to China and India, if at a drastically reduced price. In addition, military expansion in the prized Arctic region has carved a lucrative new trade route that could prove decisive in years to come. Economically, Russia looks more than capable of funding the war for as long as necessary. In fact, some business experts are of the opinion that the Russian economy is so reliant upon the war now that Moscow simply can't afford to pull out of Ukraine for the foreseeable future. Perhaps even more worryingly are rumors that Russia has been holding back some of its more advanced modern military capabilities. In a report from Reuters from February of this year, Putin claimed that 95% of Russia's strategic nuclear forces had been modernized and that the Air Force has just taken delivery of 4 new supersonic nuclear-capable bombers. If that's true, it only adds to Zelensky's woes and puts even more pressure on his allies. With a significant number of US, French and British troops assembling close to the theater of war, and Moscow looking to make another decisive move on the geopolitical chessboard, the future couldn't be more uncertain. Whether an increasingly unlikely diplomatic solution can be found, or whether a change in the White House will force every nation's hand, is yet to be seen. But if Macron's words are anything to go by, Western troops could well be mobilized and ready to enter Ukraine sooner than anybody could ever have imagined or feared. Now we're coming to the end of the video, it's time to ask you what you think about the potential Western troop deployment in Ukraine. Was February's statement of intent no more than an empty threat from Macron to see exactly how Putin would react? Or do you think the conflict, now in its 3rd calendar year, has reached a stage where Western intervention is all but inevitable? After all, the military aid packages from NATO countries in particular are unsustainable in the long term, and with Putin's recent landslide re-election and some Russian political experts predicting a much longer war than anticipated, the time for the West to act may well be upon us. If not, Russian aggression could see the country take decisive steps into Central and maybe even Western Europe. Let us know what you think in the comments below, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out why Poland would destroy Russia in a war, or click this other video instead. It's February 2024 and a meeting is taking place in Paris. It involves some of the most powerful leaders in the world, the majority of whom are European and members of NATO. The meeting has two purposes. One, it gives all in attendance a chance to discuss Russia's recent advancements in Ukraine, particularly the taking of Avdiivka, which hampers Ukraine's efforts in the Donetsk region. What will those leaders do to shore up Ukraine and help it fight back against the advancing Russian troops? Secondly, the meeting is supposed to send a statement of solidarity with Ukraine, serving as a warning to Vladimir Putin that his invasion won't be accepted quietly. France's President Emmanuel Macron took both purposes a little too literally. While the rest of NATO members at the meeting tried to balance their responses, he said, "There is no consensus to officially back any ground troops. That said, nothing should be excluded. We will do everything that we can to make sure that Russia does not prevail." In the space of 3 sentences, Macron implied there was a possibility that NATO might send troops to Ukraine, marking a direct military action that it has avoided up to this point. The response was utter confusion among Macron's fellow NATO leaders. Several attempted to backpedal the comments on Macron's behalf, such as Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, who said there would be no NATO ground troops sent to Ukrainian soil. The United States sent an equally clear message, with the White House national security spokesperson pointing out that President Joe Biden has been clear that the US will not send troops to fight in Ukraine. The small fire that Macron lit should have been extinguished right there. However, Macron, rather than walking back his comments under intense pressure from his allies, chose to double down. Just days after the meeting in which he made these remarks, he found himself at the Olympic Village France is building in Paris in preparation for the 2024 Olympics. Quizzed by reporters, he told them that the Ukraine crisis was a sufficiently serious issue. Every word he said was measured, weighed, and thought through, he said, suggesting that the idea of dragging NATO into Ukraine has been on his mind for a while. That brings us to the 2 questions we'll answer in this video. Why does France, and Macron in particular, want to enter Ukraine? And perhaps more importantly, will he be able to force NATO into the fight if he chooses to send French troops onto Ukrainian soil? To answer the first of those questions, we have to delve into France's military history. France has been considered one of the world's most powerful military nations. Napoleonic France, especially, saw the nation reach immense military heights, leading it to briefly ruling over a colonial empire that included large swathes of Africa. Expansion of that colonial empire continued through much of the first half of the 19th century, with France achieving key victories over the Habsburgs and Russia. Then it all started to fall apart. Perhaps overconfident following its latest victories, France appeared to underestimate the threat posed to it by Prussia. When the 2 nations went to war in 1870, France was defeated in a little over a year, ending any semblance of control it had over Europe while also paving the way for a united Germany to become one of the continent's major powers. It only got worse for France as it entered the 20th century. World War I brought with it another fight with Germany and a war that would lead to France losing 1,397,800 soldiers, along with 300,000 civilians. All told, France accounted for 25% of the war's deaths, second only to Russia, and was weakened even further militarily. When World War II came around, France was quickly overrun by the Nazis, with the country then having to rely on external allies and its own resistance movements to fight back against Nazi rule. It was another costly war. France recorded 217,600 military deaths and a staggering 350,000 civilian deaths. In less than 100 years, France had gone from being one of Europe's most impressive military powers to one of the weakest among the continent's major nations. Despite coming out on the winning side in World War II, France had seen 400,000 of its buildings destroyed, with 10 times that number being damaged, and was producing just 40% of what it had before the war in agricultural and industrial sectors. But there were some bright spots. Despite the damage at home, France had most of its colonial empire intact, at least for a while. Soon it would find itself fighting multiple wars overseas to try and maintain that empire, most of which it lost. It was this series of losses that led to France focusing on rebuilding its army while creating new relationships within Europe. In 1957, it became a founding member of the European Economic Community, which would later evolve into the European Union, or EU, showcasing a desire to build through collaboration. The country was also a founding member of NATO, again setting itself up as a team player in an organization designed to keep the peace. France wished to position itself as a problem solver, a peacekeeper, and to do that, it would have to back that positioning with a stronger military. That brings us to today. According to Global Firepower, France has the world's 11th strongest military. Its army has 200,000 active personnel, with another 26,000 in reserve, and it maintains plentiful stocks of aircraft, naval vessels, and ground-based equipment. It's also a nuclear nation, one of only 9 in the world, with a stockpile of 290 nukes that make it a clear threat to any other country on the planet. But now you're likely asking yourself what any of this has to do with dragging NATO into the Ukraine war. This brief history highlights how France went through an extended period of military humiliation only to pull itself back into a position of geopolitical importance. It did that by forming alliances and rebuilding its military, and it did it knowing full well that an aggressive nation that goes unchecked not only presents a threat to the country it invades, but can go on to threaten many more. It saw that in World War II, when Germany took Poland and went on to dominate most of Europe before the Allies found a way to fight back. And perhaps Macron is seeing something similar occurring in Russia and Ukraine today. He may see the war as the starting point of something much larger, with his comments about sending NATO troops into Ukraine being intended to show that France would fight against Russian aggression. He may also have wanted them to serve as a reminder to his NATO allies that fighting against such a threat would require a unified show of force, allowing him to argue for all of NATO to get directly involved in the war. Plus, by being the driving force behind NATO involvement, Macron would stand as the first person to suggest direct action in Ukraine. France could emphasize its position as a peacekeeper and gain more power on the geopolitical level. But those reasons are speculative and far from the only possible reasons behind Macron's statements. It's also worth pointing out that France faces plenty of problems at home that could have caused Macron to suggest NATO action in Ukraine. He's dealing with a nation in crisis over immigration. According to the Permanent Mission of France to the United Nations in New York, France is currently home to around 700,000 asylum seekers and refugees. It's also a heavy contributor to the Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees, contributing about $100.6 million to the organization, which all again feeds into this image of France as a nation building itself up through helping and cooperating with others. The problem is that the country has a significant far-right contingent that opposes such heavy immigration. In January 2024, Macron unveiled a controversial bill that was immediately made law that implements a host of measures intended to curb immigration in the country. That bill makes it more difficult for those who move to France to bring their family members along with them, as well as limiting access to welfare benefits. Worse yet for immigrants, any children they have in France would no longer automatically become French citizens under jus soli, or right of the soil, and instead will have to apply for citizenship at some point between the ages of 16 and 18. The bill has prompted mass protests in the streets of France, with 16,000 people marching in Paris in the immediate aftermath of its publication, with 75,000 in total protesting nationwide. It's also worth pointing out that France has taken in fewer Ukrainian refugees than any other nation in the European Union. Of the 4.3 million people who have been displaced by the war, France has only accepted 64,720. That pales in comparison to Germany, which has welcomed 1.2 million refugees, and Poland with 1 million. All told, France welcomes fewer than 1 Ukrainian refugee for every 1,000 citizens, compared to many EU countries that are welcoming 25 for every 1,000. What does any of this have to do with France and NATO entering Ukraine? It shows that France is currently a divided nation. With his comments in February, Macron may have been attempting to distract from the problems the country has internally, instead shifting the focus away from his controversial policies toward a common enemy, Russia. Plus, he could always make the argument that tackling Russia now would mean France faces less pressure to take in Ukrainian refugees, which would be a win with the far-right elements of his party as far as he's concerned. So we now have 2 possible reasons for Macron to want to get involved in Ukraine. France's history, especially in terms of falling victim to aggressive European powers, may play a role, as could the country's immigration crisis. But there are other issues at play, namely the Wagner Group. That group is an interesting example of how the Russian military works. In addition to the country's main military, it also funds and supports the activities of several mercenary organizations. The Wagner Group is perhaps the foremost of these organizations, with the group technically operating independently of the Russian state. But in reality, it's often used in operations designed to enhance Russia's influence around the world without Moscow and its military having to get directly involved. Operations like its recent activities in Africa. We mentioned earlier that France used to have a colonial empire that covered much of Africa. Though the nations it controlled are largely independent of France today, many are still influenced by French culture. A large portion of the 700,000 immigrants living in France today come from its former colonies, and there's even a name for the system that France uses to engage with its former colonies, the Francafrique. For decades, Francafrique has enabled Paris to maintain some levels of influence throughout Africa. But thanks to recent actions by the Wagner Group, among others, that influence is on the wane. Take what happened in Mali in May 2022 as an example. For 9 years, France had stationed a military contingent in the country to help it deal with threats of Islamic terrorism and rampant instability. When those troops arrived, France was hailed as the hero that would save Mali. Again, we see France's desired role as the peacekeeper come into play. And for a while, Operation Barkhane, the name France used for its activities in Mali, was a success. France helped to train the Malian army, particularly in the use of air and ground technologies, helping to strengthen the country against the various threats it faced. Unfortunately for France, the Sahel, which is seen as a hotbed of Islamic insurgency, was a problem that it was never able to solve. Since France entered the country, Mali has seen 2.5 million of its citizens displaced, along with thousands of military and civilian casualties. The relationship between France and Mali began to sour in 2020. 2 years later, Macron ordered all 2,400 French troops stationed in the country to withdraw, essentially leaving the Malians to their own devices once more. Except that's not what happened. Instead, the Wagner Group stepped in to fill the vacuum left by the departure of the French soldiers. Universidad de Navarra suggests that Wagner's deployment in the country began in December 2021, 6 months before France's withdrawal. The group quickly established relationships with Mali's military junta, essentially creating Russian influence in a country that was previously supported and influenced by France. But that's not all. In addition to withdrawing troops from the African continent, France has had to deal with a constant campaign of disinformation related to its actions there. For instance, March 2023 saw a video begin circulating on the web that showed armed men storming a gold mine in the Central African Republic, or the CAR, and killing 9 Chinese nationals. In the video, a rebel fighter from the CAR is seen proclaiming that the French want to drive Wagner out of Africa. Alarm bells rang in Paris. The implication from the video was that Paris had ordered the storming of the mine, perhaps intending to use the murders to discredit its Russian rival and strengthen its influence in the CAR once more. It's unlikely that was the case, with Reuters suggesting that the video was part of a concerted campaign of disinformation and Russian propaganda designed to paint France as the villain in the eyes of the wider African population. And it worked. While it's inaccurate to claim that Francafrique is no more, it's certainly less effective today than it was even a decade ago. And therein lies another reason why France might want to enter Ukraine. It sees that it's losing influence to Russia. Where the Wagner Group has helped to strengthen Moscow's influence in Africa, the Russian military is looking to do the same in Europe. If Russia takes Ukraine, then the obvious question, at least in Macron's mind, is who's next. After all, Macron has seen Russia advance in Ukraine. Though Kyiv enjoyed some early success in the war, aided by financial backing from the West, it managed to push Russian forces back and cause serious damage to the Black Sea Fleet. It's been capitulating ever since. Its counter-offensive in 2023 ended in failure, and Russia has been able to take territory ever since. Avdiivka is a prime example, with the war increasingly looking like it will end in a Russian victory unless Western nations are able to intervene further. Taking Ukraine gives Russia more influence in Europe, and with that influence could come an emboldened Moscow. Next on the agenda, potentially Moldova. Though Moldova works closely with NATO, it's not a member of the organization. As such, Putin won't have to worry about triggering Article 5 of NATO's charter, as an invasion of Moldova wouldn't be a strike at a NATO member nation. But it would allow Russia to push further west, taking another slice of Europe in the process while expanding its influence. Chatham House suggests that Russia is already engaging in many familiar tactics to stir the pot in Moldova. The country's public information spaces are being targeted with disinformation, all designed to eat away at the country's social cohesion. Plus, Moscow is actively backing pro-Russian opposition to Moldova's president, Maia Sandu, with success meaning it could potentially turn Moldova into a proxy state. Chatham House calls this campaign of destabilization Russia's hybrid measures, and there's evidence of it in Moscow's attempts to influence the country's elections. In 2023, Moscow sent around $55 million into Moldova in an effort to buy votes and strengthen the country's pro-Russian groups. Moldova's National Security Service has even accused Russia's oligarchs of getting involved. They believe Moldovan oligarch Ilan Shor paid millions to stage protests in the country to further Moscow's agenda. All of this shows that Russia has a definite interest in controlling Moldova. And if it hasn't been able to achieve its goal through hybrid measures, its next step might be to try and take the country by force. It would have to wait until it succeeds in Ukraine, giving itself time to replenish its diminished forces. But once it's ready, it could use Ukraine's border with Moldova as the launching point for a new invasion. After all, Putin knows that NATO won't come to Moldova's defense with anything other than money and equipment. It's proven that in Ukraine already. Macron will also be well aware that many of the tactics Russia is using in Moldova are tactics it's already used against France. We saw that with the video that leaked from the CAR, with that piece of propaganda clearly implying France was responsible for the assault, and it's an issue that Macron increasingly has to deal with at home. According to Matthew Droin, a fellow of the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, France has been a particular target of hybrid attacks, cyber and disinformation recently. This probably helped Macron come to terms with the reality of a more aggressive Russia. Perhaps that's what Macron means when he says that his comments about sending NATO troops into Ukraine were well thought out. He's already seeing Russia invade France, albeit in a non-traditional way, and he knows Moscow is gradually reducing his country's influence in Africa and Europe. Perhaps he sees this as part of a wider campaign that involves the entirety of NATO. After all, if Putin is so willing to target France, he's likely spreading disinformation and sowing seeds of discontent in other NATO countries. Finally, there's one other issue that could be pushing Macron to want to enter Ukraine: Donald Trump. During his current presidential campaigning, Trump has repeatedly claimed that he would withdraw the US from NATO if the other members don't start paying their way. That's a threat that much of Europe is taking seriously, even if it ultimately proves hollow. As Artin Dersimonian, a research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, puts it, undoubtedly, concerns about a second Trump presidency have woken Europeans up to the fact that they need to do more for their own defense. He goes on to say that this realization may have given Macron the push he needed to work towards strategic autonomy from the United States. News outlet Al Jazeera appears to agree, claiming that Macron wants to advance a vision of a Europe that doesn't have to rely on Washington to support in defending itself. In that context, perhaps Macron's comments about sending NATO troops into Ukraine weren't directed at every NATO member. Instead, they may have been designed as a wake-up call to the rest of Europe about the need to present a stronger united front against an increasingly aggressive Russia. After all, the US may be Russia's biggest rival, but it's Europe that has to deal with Putin in its backyard. All of this leads us to a final question. Is it possible that France could actually force NATO into the war in Ukraine? If you listen to Macron's fellow NATO members, the answer is a categorical no. As we pointed out at the beginning of the video, most of France's compatriots were quick to distance themselves from Macron's remarks. Germany's Chancellor and the United States were joined in their denials that a NATO presence in Ukraine is a viable option by the UK's Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. He said that Britain has no plans to engage in a large-scale military deployment in Ukraine, instead limiting itself to the people it has stationed there to help train Ukrainian soldiers. Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni was equally quick to issue a denial, with NATO's Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg also denying that sending troops into Ukraine was a consideration. Ukraine isn't a NATO member, so why should it receive that level of support? Russia, for its part, had a field day with Macron's comments. Soon after they were made, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov was quick to point out that any such action would lead to a direct conflict between Russia and NATO. In that case, he said, we would need to talk not about the probability, but about the inevitability of direct conflict. The counter-threat was issued. And a month later, in March 2024, President Vladimir Putin made it clear that Russia had no intention to start a war with NATO. Speaking to Russian military pilots during a visit to one of the country's air bases, he claimed that any statements made about Russia's intentions to attack any other country in Europe after it wins in Ukraine were sheer nonsense. He called the very concept of Russia going to war with NATO ravings, in what was clearly a none-too-subtle dig at Macron. Putin used Macron's statements to undermine France's president, just as France believes he's using cyber and disinformation campaigns to undermine France itself. Still, should France choose to go it alone, would it be able to drag any of its NATO allies into the conflict along with it? That question is more difficult to answer. Macron may hope that his NATO allies would apply Article 5 of the NATO Charter to the situation. However, they wouldn't have to. Article 5 only covers attacks on NATO allies on their home soil. France entering Ukraine and subsequently being attacked doesn't fit that description, meaning Macron would be hoping that his allies would simply support his actions rather than being guaranteed their support. So where does all of this leave France in the context of the Ukraine crisis? Macron clearly believes that now is the time to involve NATO directly in the war. He wouldn't have raised the possibility if he didn't. He may see Russia's increasing aggression as an early sign that it has ambitions to take control of other European countries, such as Moldova, and may even believe that the crisis in Ukraine is simply the precursor for a wider war that could engulf all of Europe. To Macron, NATO has to nip that possibility in the bud now by asserting its dominance in the region and pushing Russia out of Ukraine. But there's also some self-interest at play here. France has increasingly found itself the victim of hybrid attacks by Russia, with Macron himself having been undermined by Putin in the wake of his comments. It's also seeing Russia's influence grow in Africa as France's wanes, giving Macron a geopolitical reason to want to quell Putin's ambitions. Plus, focusing his nation on war would help to distract from other issues, such as immigration, that are causing divides in France into which Russia's disinformation campaigns could feed. Whatever the case may be, Macron would have to do a lot more than simply send French troops into Ukraine to convince his NATO allies that they need to send troops of their own. And that's where we turn the questions over to you. Do you believe that NATO will ever enter Ukraine, as Macron suggests they should? How much of a threat, if any, do you feel Russia will pose to the rest of Europe if it wins the war in Ukraine? And do you believe Macron's fears of an ever-strengthening Russia are well-founded? Tell us what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out why France is preparing for all-out war, or click this other video instead. After the fall of Avdiivka in February 2024, French President Emmanuel Macron stated that the West should do everything it could to make sure Russia does not prevail in Ukraine. He pointed out that past taboos, like sending long-range missiles to the Ukrainian military, had already been broken. Therefore, the West should not rule out potentially putting boots on the ground. Macron, who called the meeting where he made these remarks, represented a nation whose higher-ups are increasingly worried about the Russian economy's transition to a wartime footing. To the French, such a transition, and its contribution to renewed Russian effectiveness on the battlefield, greatly threatens the security of Europe. Europe would therefore need to see to its defense and the maintenance of a first-rate domestic defense industry. As part of this broader security focus, France is rearming again and bidding to reclaim the place it had occupied for centuries, the most powerful military state on the European continent. In this video, we will look at France's arms build-up and what its efforts mean for Europe's broader defense posture. Despite its reputation, France has long been a large military spender in Europe. Even in the period of peace after the end of the Cold War, France never fell far below NATO's 2% benchmark. Its lowest military expenditure between 1991 and 2022 was 1.8% of GDP. In January 2023, Paris announced it would increase military spending by more than a third between 2024 and 2030. The result is that the military budget would have doubled since President Macron came to office in 2017. In addressing this new increase, Macron acknowledged that the post-Cold War era, which he called a peace dividend, had come to an end. The new military spending, he said, will be designed to make France a forward-thinking military, capable of being one war ahead. Major investments in the new build-up would include drones, cyber warfare, and intelligence. The strategy would be one designed to fight a peer or near-peer conflict as opposed to the asymmetric operations France has long taken part in on the African continent, which mostly involve rapid skirmishes and counterinsurgency operations with low-level firepower. France is currently ranked as the world's 11th most powerful military in the Global Firepower Index. It has a 200,000-strong active-duty army with an additional 26,000 in reserve and 150,000 paramilitary personnel. It has a robust air force with 972 total aircraft. 224 of these are fighters, 118 are transports, 140 are trainers, 44 are special mission planes, 17 are tankers, and 447 are helicopters, 69 of which are of the attack variety. On the ground, France is a lot more vulnerable. It only has 222 active tanks, and not all of them are ready to be deployed. It has over 85,000 other military vehicles, but only 96 self-propelled artillery units, 9 multiple launch rockets or MLRS systems, and no towed artillery units. These rankings were current as of January 2024. This comparatively small stockpile is a big problem for the French and Europe, as the war in Ukraine has revealed how rapidly these assets can be destroyed in a peer or near-peer conflict. Russia's tank losses have been notorious, but even at the height of its effectiveness in the summer and autumn of 2022, Ukraine was still losing 2 tanks a day, which would only give the active French tank fleet a few months before depletion. To address these deficiencies, France began a 20-year military modernization program called Project Scorpion, which began its concept phase in 2010 and officially launched in 2014. That date was no coincidence, as it marked the start of the troubles in Ukraine. Russia's actions back then signaled to Paris that the post-Cold War peace dividend might be on its last legs. The next year, France reversed its trend of budget cuts to its military and began to spend more on defense. In 2016, the French government pledged $6.7 billion over the following 11 years as part of the Scorpion program. A major part of this program is to modernize France's tanks and vehicles. Project Scorpion set out to upgrade 200 Leclerc main battle tanks as the centerpiece of its vehicle-centric focus. Additionally, there are ongoing upgrades to over 1,800 Griffon armored personnel carriers and 978 Serval vehicles. New procurements have been part of the armored build-up too, with France setting out to acquire over 2,000 new Serval VBMRL vehicles, 625 new VBCI infantry fighting vehicles, and 300 new EBRC Jaguar armored reconnaissance vehicles. The Jaguar was introduced into service in 2022 and is a major improvement over the earlier AMX-10RC and ERC-90 Sagaï vehicles, which are steadily being retired. The Jaguar is a good choice not only for reconnaissance but also as a fire support platform. Its 40mm cannon, MPP anti-tank missiles, and remote-controlled 7.62mm machine gun are well suited to making it a mobile firepower unit. It also has smoke grenade launchers to help protect it from enemy fire. It has a top speed of 90 km/h and a range of 800 km. The Jaguar is cheap, and it saves expenses on both of the earlier vehicles it replaced, and it uses the same chassis as the VBMR Griffon, which in turn is based on a commercial truck chassis. Although the price of €1 million was the original intent, the vehicle's sophistication and enhanced capabilities led to a unit price of approximately €5 million. Many of the parts needed for the Jaguar can instead be adapted from civilian sources. The Jaguar is therefore capable but also easily replaceable in a peer or near-peer conflict, making it ideal for France's new focus on high-intensity, state-based warfare. The upgrades to the VBMR Griffon have the same idea in mind. All of the Project Scorpion upgrades and new acquisitions have been done under the operations of a consortium of French companies. Such a move was meant to ensure a robust domestic defense sector. The companies involved in this initiative included Nexter, Thales, and Renault Trucks Defense. The first 689 of the new Serval VBMRL vehicles are expected to enter service by next year. As mentioned, military intelligence capabilities are a key part of the Scorpion buildup. Specifically, France seeks to emulate the data-sharing attributes of the United States Armed Forces, which allow unprecedented interoperability of arms to destroy targets as needed. For example, an F-35 fighter jet could use its stealth qualities to penetrate an enemy air defense zone and find a target of opportunity. But rather than giving away its position by opening its internal weapons bay to fire a missile, it can call upon a cruise missile strike from a ship at sea or an artillery strike from a HIMARS system hundreds of miles away, sharing the precise coordinates of the enemy through its unprecedented sensor fusion and situational awareness. Although ground forces are not quite as capable, France is looking to increase its vehicles' situational awareness. This part of Project Scorpion is called Combined Collaborative Combat. As an example, the Jaguar is loaded with sensors and electronic warfare measures. It has an Antares missile alert system that has 360-degree coverage and the Thales Barge, an active jamming device that interferes with improvised explosive devices. There is also an acoustic sensor mounted to the roof to spot enemy gunfire. This is called the Metrovib Pilar V. The Antares system will also be equipped on the upgraded Leclercs and Griffon APCs. Providing the new vehicles with improved situational awareness will help to create a smarter military, capable of sharing data between branches and creating something like a French kill web. An example might be a Jaguar using its sophisticated sensors to approach an enemy attack position. This would normally be dangerous, but the accurate data it will provide would then be sent to air or artillery support to wipe out the enemy tanks and move on to the next task. This is the way in which more lightly armed American soldiers in Iraq were often able to get the better of Iraqi tank units. So France's new vehicles, while not being quite as capable as those of the United States, will still provide intelligent, powerful, and reliable platforms for its armed forces. They will also be far more replaceable, meaning that the French economy would not need to spend years retooling for a war in order to make them producible at the scale needed to deal with the attrition rate of a peer-based battlefield. In contrast, vehicles like the US Army's Stryker infantry carrier require much more specialized parts that will be difficult to produce in a peacetime economy. Aside from its hardware upgrades and new procurements, Project Scorpion aims to enhance interoperability between the armies of Europe. For example, Belgium has cooperated with France in producing the Jaguar, and it too operates the vehicle. In 2019, Belgium announced it would buy at least 60 Jaguars and 382 Griffons. This makes cross-training and shared logistics between the two countries easier. Indeed, Belgium has cooperated with France in supporting and operating the vehicles. In 2021, Luxembourg was assessing whether it too should join France's Project Scorpion. For President Macron, this inter-European cooperation is an essential part of his strategy for France. Years before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, he was one of several prominent European policymakers urging the necessity of a security posture for Europe that was independent of the United States. To him, while American cooperation and the NATO alliance remains essential, Europe needed to do more to create a stable security framework through its own actions, especially given the turbulent domestic politics in the United States and a shifting foreign policy focus in Washington. European countries, in other words, could no longer afford to be the free riders that President Obama and Trump had accused them of being. The war in Ukraine and dwindling American support as its presidential election year ramped up spurred his comments in February 2024. "We cannot wait for the outcome of the American elections to decide what our future is going to be. It's the future of Europe that's at stake, so therefore it's up to the Europeans to decide. If others want to join in and help, fantastic, but that's just an added bonus." Macron insisted that Europe must take the lead in supplying Ukraine with badly needed ammunition and must further buttress a domestic defense industry. He supported Estonia's idea for the European Union to issue defense bonds for such a purpose, although the Germans and Dutch are so far resistant to this proposal. The expansion of Project Scorpion to include other countries in Europe would be a natural evolution of this philosophy. France has already fielded a Scorpion modernized brigade and plans to field its first Scorpion modernized armored division next year. However, the French have no plans to stop with Project Scorpion. More recently, Paris has announced a second phase of the broader military modernization push, a phase it calls Project Titan, which was launched in 2018. While Scorpion largely focused on France's fleet of lighter vehicles, Titan's primary objective will be to modernize and better equip the country with heavier instruments of war, such as tanks, artillery, helicopters, and aircraft. Titan's primary objective is to deliver the necessary combined arms equipment for high-intensity, state-based warfare as part of an all-aspect approach to warfare. According to Charles Baudouin, a retired general in the French army who led Scorpion in the technical section, Titan will aim to aggregate the lower-intensity experiences seen in the War on Terror with the higher-intensity type of warfare seen in Ukraine. Strategies to counter anti-access area denial systems are a big part of Project Titan, and France is carefully studying how this A2AD environment might evolve before it makes big purchases. As the action in Ukraine has revealed the importance of rapid infantry response and situational awareness via drones, Paris is likely pleased with the emphasis of the earlier Project Scorpion, and a new push to make capable drones is natural. France is also well aware that these lighter, more mobile forces have defeated heavier units such as tanks through the use of systems like portable anti-armor weapons and even commercial drones armed with anti-tank grenades. A study of these emerging realities will influence the purchases and improvements of heavy equipment under Titan. The emphasis on situational awareness and data sharing seen in Project Scorpion will be continued in Titan. As part of this focus, the French army is working with the Procurement Office to create a high-capacity data network set to enter service after 2040. In May 2022, Arnaud Goujon, a colonel in the French army who was attending a conference on land weapons hosted by France's Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique think tank, described the effort as a strategy of simultaneity. He mentioned that Titan was not just about platforms, in other words, it was about software as much as hardware. Extending a combat cloud for the country's ground forces is a way to follow up on Project Scorpion's drive to deliver lighter and medium vehicles to the French military and further improve their situational awareness. As part of this, the French plan to use a next-generation communication system that calls on metadata and is enhanced with artificial intelligence to speed up data sharing and decision-making. All Project Scorpion vehicles will be upgraded with the breakthroughs that Titan produces, enabling an extension of their service life, which is important because even the new Jaguar will be entering the middle of its ordinarily expected service life by the time Titan updates are all finished. Titan partially aims to cover the gaps that Project Scorpion will leave in its wake once it's completed. One of the bigger gaps in Scorpion was the relative lack of defense against anti-tank missiles and drones. The French brass also expects the new Titan-produced vehicles to come with intelligent robotics, at least in a few cases. Once the French brass gets a complete review on the demands for heavy equipment on the modern battlefield, Project Titan plans for a number of hardware upgrades. The centerpiece of these upgrades will be a successor to the Leclerc tank, which has been in service since the early 1990s. Details are sparse as to whether this is officially a part of Project Titan, but France and Germany have been collaborating on a new tank since at least 2018. Back then, the Leopard's manufacturer, Germany's KMW company, and France's Next Defense Systems, which makes the Leclerc, collaborated to produce a hybrid of the two tanks and demonstrated their capacity to work together. France and Germany have decided to create a next-generation main battle tank under the moniker of Main Ground Combat System. The two countries intend to replace their respective main battle tanks with the product of the MGCS by 2040. In 2018, Janes noted that the date could be moved up a few years because the collaboration between the two countries was already well advanced. There are also reportedly unmanned systems to go along with the new tank. The two countries are also working on a new artillery project called the Common Indirect Fire System. This will be a self-propelled howitzer which will replace France's Caesar and Germany's PZH-2000. This new artillery is expected to enter service by around 2035. In building the new artillery system, Titan will draw on two European Union studies on future artillery systems. These are the Future Indirect Fires European Solution (FIRES) and the European Common Long-Range Indirect Fire Support System (ECOLORS). These studies each got a budget of almost $4 million and are expected to be completed this year. FIRES will look at potential next-generation 155mm artillery shells and rockets, while ECOLORS will consider an improved European 155mm cannon and whether this and a rocket launcher can be mounted on a hybrid truck. The French are looking to the skies as well, hoping that Titan will create a next-generation helicopter to replace the Tiger, which came into service in the 1990s. Project Titan also aims to create a replacement for the Mistral 3. The Mistral is a family of short-range air defense missile systems that can be deployed from vehicles, ships, helicopters, and even in a portable configuration. Development of this system began in 1974 and it entered service in 1989. The Mistral 3 boasts better imaging processing abilities and enhanced engagement against targets that have minimal heat signatures, such as drones, turbojet-powered missiles, and fast attack craft at distances up to 7.5 kilometers. The Mistral 3 is also resistant against electronic warfare countermeasures. The Titan replacement will presumably improve on these attributes. It will be a mobile, ground-to-air, low-altitude system. Baudouin claims that Project Titan aims to offer total superiority by 2050. Obstacles remain for the project, however. For example, it's unclear if the MCGS project will go off without a hitch. The potential for the French and Germans to reduce their level of cooperation in the face of pressures from competing interests from other companies who want a place at the table remains. These are companies such as Germany's Rheinmetall and Krauss-Maffei-Wegmann, who have expressed their intention to be part of the new tank project. Rheinmetall is also working on its own new tank, the KF-51 Panther, which it began developing in 2016. It plans to target Leopard operators for sales of this tank. Meanwhile, another competing tank, the Enhanced Main Battle Tank, might also threaten the MCGS. This vehicle is manufactured by the aforementioned KNDS. Both companies would naturally like to see their projects prevail over the MCGS idea. Nevertheless, France is banking that Project Titan will successfully enhance its military capabilities. Paris is confident enough that it's looking even further into the future than Titan. Perhaps this is because of the ongoing success of Project Scorpion, which has generally delivered its ambitions on time and on budget. Looking further ahead, there's also Project Vulcan, which invests heavily in cyber warfare and will attempt to make the French army compatible with modern robotics by 2040. Another part of the war in Ukraine that France has tried to internalize is the renewed power of defensive armaments and the role that new technologies held by civilians plays on the modern battlefield. For example, civilians equipped with smartphones and drones can help to transmit the locations and movements of armed forces to other parties, threatening operational security. Finding answers to these challenges will be an important part of France's broader military buildup. Despite its reputation in some segments of popular culture, the French military has remained a capable and experienced fighting force. However, the war in Ukraine has driven home key vulnerabilities in Paris's arsenal and approach to warfare, especially in vehicles, drones, and artillery systems. France has seen no choice but to adapt to modern geopolitical and military realities. France was long Europe's leading military power. Now, with the United States increasingly focused on countering China in the Indo-Pacific region and its uncertain domestic politics making its commitment to European security less clear, Paris once again aims to take up the mantle and create a momentum that will allow the rest of the continent to follow in its wake. If Project Scorpion, Titan, and Vulcan succeed as intended, the French will be on their way to fielding a fighting force that will not only serve Paris's needs, but have a chance to serve as the pivot of European military affairs, as it had generally between the 14th and 19th centuries. But will these projects succeed as Paris and President Macron intend? Don't forget to let us know what you think in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out how the German military will become Europe's most powerful, or click this other video instead. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the idea of geopolitics as a zero-sum game of winners and losers quickly fell out of fashion. Since then, Western leaders have largely sought to guarantee peace through close, mutually beneficial economic ties with traditional enemies. But has it actually worked out? Well, in the case of Europe and Russia, this doctrine backfired badly. European purchases of Russian energy did not deter Putin from invading Ukraine. Instead, Putin used Europe's reliance on Russian energy as a mechanism of blackmail. However, one major Western power has consistently bucked this philosophy and is finally reaping the benefits of self-sufficiency: France. So how did they do it? France has a long independent streak among America's allies. Charles de Gaulle famously took the country out of NATO, and the country has maintained a uniquely strong nuclear power sector rather than accepting dependence on cheap Russian gas. In recent years, this has helped keep energy prices and inflation under control, while the UK and Germany have slid into recession. Another dimension of the French strategy of self-sufficiency is military production. Among Western countries, the French government is unique in insisting that French weapons are completely homegrown. While Germany, Sweden, Britain, and Italy have significant arms industries, they often incorporate American-made systems. This isn't a one-way exchange either. The American M1 Abrams uses guns designed and manufactured in Germany. This has traditionally left France as something of a maverick. Even if its weapons were as good or better compared to German and American offerings, prospective arms buyers usually preferred the political and diplomatic benefits of partnering with Berlin or Washington. If a state's leaders didn't desire ties with the US or were cautious of being vulnerable to US sanctions, they'd buy Russian weapons. So what changed? From 2009 to 2013, France was the number 5 arms exporter, having lost its traditional number 4 spot to an ascendant China. Russian arms sales were nearly 6 times greater, and it was unimaginable that it could lose the number 2 spot to France, but that's exactly what happened. Every 5 years, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI, publishes a report, Trends in International Arms Transfers. According to the last 3 editions, French arms sales have more than doubled in the past decade, while Russian arms exports have fallen by 60%. The rise of France and the fall of Russia has been happening slowly before our eyes for the past decade, and the diplomatic and economic fallout of the Ukraine war suddenly finalized the process. And what a difference a decade can make. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the new Russian Federation inherited the overwhelming majority of the USSR's famous, or rather infamous, weapons industry. It retained the ability to produce already prolific weapons systems like the AK assault rifle line, the T-series tanks, Sukhoi and MiG fighters, and various types of ships. While the war in Ukraine has exposed serious flaws in some of these systems, buying Soviet and Russian weapons was nonetheless a complete, affordable alternative to buying weapons with strings attached from the United States. During the crisis years of the 1990s, the Russian government experienced severe revenue shortfalls, and the arms industry survived largely thanks to the continued demand for Soviet legacy systems. As late as 2008, analysts with the Russian think tank KAST, the Center for Analysis of Strategies and Technologies, observed that the nation with the largest numbers of the best Russian tanks wasn't Russia at all, but was in fact India. However, the Russian arms industry was rapidly approaching a new peak in weapons development, domestic acquisitions, and exports. So how did they turn it around? Rising revenues from oil and natural gas, together with Vladimir Putin's ambitions in Eastern Europe, marked an increase in domestic arms purchases during the next decade. Russia reaped most of the benefits of growing weapons demand, particularly with increased sales to China and India. From 2009 to 2013, Russia supplied 52 states with weapons and led the world in tank and ship sales. SIPRI estimates that Russia's most important category of major weapons sales was aircraft, which accounted for 43% of all exports. In 2009, KAST estimates that sales of all aerospace equipment constituted 60% of Russian military exports. Russia accounted for 27% of the global weapons exports from 2009 to 2013. At the same time, the US only commanded 29% of global arms sales, and it seemed possible Russia might become the leading arms exporter. Meanwhile, France was far behind either of those two titans. French weapons accounted for just 5% of global arms exported in this period. But that was all about to change. France had a world-class weapons industry and was no stranger to foreign partnerships, as it had partnered with the United Arab Emirates to fund the development and manufacture of the excellent Leclerc main battle tank. However, France struggled to find a large arms export market. Arms procurement is a political and diplomatic process, and European leaders generally prefer buying American or German weapons, while Russia dominated Oceania and Asia. Fast forward a decade, and Russian arms sales are at an all-time low. Total Russian arms sales tumbled by 17% from 2013 to 18 compared to the previous 4-year period, and have since collapsed by 53%. While Putin's Russia has been burning bridges and drawing international condemnation in the run-up to the war in Ukraine, Emmanuel Macron has been building relationships and promoting French weapons in a persistent charm offensive. Together with rising doubts about the quality of Russian weapons and the reliability of Russian arms sales, France's Dassault Rafale multi-role fighter has been on the attack against Russia. Not on the battlefield, mind you, but in Russia's most important arms market. While Russia sold weapons to more than 50 states in 2009 to 13 and over 30 before Ukraine war sanctions set in, the Russian arms export market has always been remarkably centralized. India has been the largest arms importer for the majority of the last 12 years, and until recently, it purchased more than 50% of its weapons from Russia. When Russian arms sales peaked, India was by far its biggest customer. Not only was India buying the most arms in the world, but from 2009 to 13, it purchased 75% of its weapons from Russia. The next largest buyer of Russian weapons is China. While China had developed a fairly impressive arms industry by this time, it still relied on Russia for various systems and types of equipment. Next up was Algeria. While it was a much smaller customer than China, Russia virtually monopolized Algerian arms purchases. These 3 states single-handedly accounted for 60% of all Russian arms sales, and similar customers like Venezuela weren't far behind. So what happened? 2 major changes set in during the span of 2014 to 18 that caused Russia to lose 17% of its sales. For one, Venezuela's hyperinflationary spiral and economic collapse had set in, and Venezuela halted virtually all Venezuelan arms imports. More seriously, Russia faced its first challenges in the Indian market. Throughout the 2014 to 18 period, India continued to import the majority of weapons from Russia. However, Russia's share dropped from 75% to 58%, as the Indian government took tentative steps toward diversification, with relatively small purchases from Israel, the United States, and France. China continued to make 70% or more of its arms purchases from Russia, but China was also buying fewer weapons as it increasingly replaced imports with domestic systems. Not only did Russia's traditional markets shrink, but Russia failed to capitalize on growing demand during this period. Saudi Arabia briefly displaced India as the #1 arms importer worldwide, and Egypt also became one of the world's leading importers. Russia had virtually no presence in Saudi arms purchases, and Egypt only sourced 30% of its arms from Russia, opting for the French Rafale over Russian aircraft. This made France the largest supplier of Egyptian weapons, leaving Russia in second place. Demand for arms was on the rise, but total Russian sales shrunk. Not only did the volume of Russian arms sales fall by 17%, but they had lost a quarter of their share of the global market. Meanwhile, sales of the Dassault Rafale had single-handedly increased France's share of the global arms market by about 30%. Despite these developments, Russia's position as #2 arms exporter still seemed unassailable. Russian arms exports had 3 times the value of French exports, with 21% of the global market against France's 6.8% share. But things were about to get worse for Russia. Much worse. And from 2019 to 23, demand for Russian arms began imploding on multiple fronts. China's demand for imported weapons fell by 44%, which included a more than 30% drop in Russian arms exports to China. Algerian arms demand also collapsed, taking approximately 10% of all Russian arms sales with it, while Egyptian purchases of Russian weapons fell by 33%. While these were bad developments, the worst for the Russian arms industry was yet to come. While Russia once accounted for over 75% of Indian arms purchases, it only accounted for 36% in 2019 to 23. And who has gained where Russia has lost? Well, most of Russia's lost market share has gone to France, whose sale of Rafale fighters and Scorpene submarines accounted for 33% of arms purchases, nearly displacing Russia as India's #1 source of weapons. And things are only getting worse for Russia. Diplomatic fallout from the Ukraine war and the economic effects of COVID have resulted in numerous smaller partners deserting Russia too. Of the 31 states buying Russian arms in 2019, only 12 made any purchases in 2023. But Russia may struggle to maintain even this demand due to shortages of supply. Serbia, a virtual satellite of Russia, has gone elsewhere after being scorned by war-related Russian failures to deliver aircraft on time. Russia is trying to turn things around though, and has increased its production of many systems at rates beyond what Western analysts thought was possible. The Russian arms industry now employs 3.5 million Russians and accounts for 20% of all Russian manufacturing. However, Russian losses on the battlefield still consistently outweigh production, so they're having to employ desperate measures to keep up. Since the start of the war, Russia has been forced to pull mothballed systems out of storage to maintain its strength in the field. It's redirected materiel earmarked for export to the war, and it's had to source drones and artillery ammunition from states such as Iran and North Korea. Whether Russia wins or loses in Ukraine, it's unclear how it will maintain this arms industry with so few customers, nor does it seem they can downsize it without causing an economic depression. And to make things even worse for Russia, this complete collapse of their arms industry has coincided with the rise of another. France has always been a significant player in the global arms market, but lacked large, long-term relationships. Just look at the M1 Abrams and Leopard 2. The US and Germany have produced thousands of these tanks, and numerous countries around the world operate them. There are less than 900 examples of France's own third-generation main battle tank, the Leclerc. Despite being the newest of the designs, production lasted only 17 years, and of the less than 900 units built, 388 went to the United Arab Emirates. Despite exporting major arms to 69 countries between 2009 and 2013, France possessed just 5% of the global market share. One of the largest sources of arms revenue at this time was simply the royalty payments France received from China, which licensed the production of French helicopters at the time. However, a pivotal moment occurred as India placed orders for 49 Mirage 2005 combat aircraft and 6 Scorpene submarines, while also expressing interest in buying up to 126 Dassault Rafale Omni-Role fighters. This was a hint at where the future of French arms sales lay, and the beginning of an extremely fruitful relationship. Between 2009 and 2018, France's arms industry saw a remarkable 261% increase in sales to the Middle East, the highest growth rate for any state's sales to the region during this period. The primary reason for this rapid growth was France's emergence as the main supplier of Egyptian arms, including an order of 52 Rafale jets, of which 24 were delivered by the end of 2018. At the same time, many states were moving away from Russian imports. Huge demand emerged for the French Rafale, and from 2019 to 23, it became one of the most in-demand planes in the world. In Europe, Greece and Croatia each placed orders for Rafales, while Serbia, a traditional ally of Russia, sought purchases of French aircraft to replace its Russian jets and transport planes. But while France struggled to compete with the US in the European market, it found 90.9% of its sales elsewhere. The bulk of France's arms exports during this time were directed towards Asia and Oceania, and in the Middle East during this time, France exported 94 Rafales, which accounted for 31% of the value of French arms exports. Demand shows no signs of slowing too, as there are outstanding orders for almost 200 more Rafales. But why is the Rafale so popular with customer nations? There are several reasons. As a 4.5 generation fighter, it balances the advantages and disadvantages of an older airframe like the F-15 and the 5th generation F-35. While not a stealth aircraft in the same sense as the F-35, the Rafale incorporates several design elements aimed at reducing its radar cross-section and enhancing its survivability in contested airspace. The Ukraine war has demonstrated that traditional 4th generation fighters can struggle to survive in the face of modern air defenses, which makes the Rafale an appealing and practical upgrade. However, the most important factors behind choosing one plane or the other are political. While the F-35 remains the most in-demand fighter in the world, with more than 1,000 having been produced and total orders being close to 3,000, those who have placed orders for F-35s have found themselves waiting, while France has been able to expedite sales by transferring Rafales directly from the French Air Force to customers. Additionally, the US is quite protective of the plane. Turkey was supposed to have access to it but was removed from the program after buying Russian S-400 air defense systems. Likewise, the logistics and internal systems of the F-35 are dependent on the continuous support of the United States. An export unit of the F-35 costs up to $130 million, and an hour of flight will cost an estimated $40,000. If a state's actions move too far away from the US, their entire investment goes up in smoke. While this is fine for close allies with shared goals, it's a problem for those with a desire to explore an independent foreign policy. Take India, for example. While the state leaders have increasingly diversified away from dependence on Russia, it refused to condemn the invasion of Ukraine and ignored Western sanctions to continue buying Russian oil at a steep discount. This stance is common in the new arms market France has found in the Middle East, North Africa, and East Asia. French weapons rely almost exclusively on homegrown systems, while many European weapons use American systems that will be vulnerable to sanctions. With heavy wartime losses restricting Russia's ability to fill orders and the collapse of demand for Russian weapons, France is uniquely positioned to absorb even more of Russia's abandoned market share. So that's the current state of things, but how does the future look for both the French and Russian arms industries? Who will win and who will lose in the global arms market? It appears that the French arms industry is poised for continued growth, buoyed by several promising developments. Deepening ties with India and the Serbian government's insistence on buying the Rafale point to the appeal French weapons hold for states traditionally friendly with France. While demand for the Rafale remains strong in the near future, there are other potential game changers in the French arms market. France is a likely partner to develop India's future-ready combat vehicle, a near-future program aiming to replace India's aging T-72s and troubled Arjun main battle tank. India's familiarity with Russia's lighter-weight autoloader-based tanks and their requirement that the tank be under 60 tons would make a modernized Leclerc a natural fit. Other Western tanks like the Leopard 2, Challenger 2, and Abrams weigh 62 to 72 tons, while different versions of the Leclerc weigh 54 to 58 tons. The Ukraine war has demonstrated that Western tanks have fantastic survivability and crew protection, but has also shown that their weight can be a tactical problem in muddy terrain and underdeveloped areas. On the other hand, Russia has experienced high tank losses in the Ukraine war. Penetrating shots frequently cause a catastrophic kill, blowing the turret into the air and killing the whole crew. France is unique among potential partners in that they have experience building tanks that fit India's desired specifications, and avoiding the Ukraine war has prevented any reputational damage to the tank. But while Leclercs have avoided the real crucible of the Ukraine war, they've seen significant service in the Yemeni civil war. While the war there has produced numerous pictures of wrecked Saudi Arab Abrams tanks, Emirati Leclercs have yet to experience a single loss. Realistically, the Leclerc and Abrams have fairly similar capabilities and protection. The most likely explanation for the difference in performance is that the Emiratis have used better tactics. Nonetheless, the Leclerc is the only major tank in the world today that still holds an unblemished record. With its low weight and thriving Franco-Indian cooperation, it could easily form the blueprint for new development under India's future-ready combat vehicle program. The program also requires that India produce at least 50% of the components of the tank domestically. The existence of an Indian-French production line would cut costs, increase availability, and make the product of any French-Indian collaboration an attractive import. This is just one example of how France is not just stepping onto the world stage as an arms manufacturer, but posing a serious challenge in Russia's most important markets. It's easy to think that France upset Russia as the number 2 arms exporter overnight, or that its rise was a direct diplomatic consequence of the Ukraine war. But the truth is that this did not happen overnight. The process of France replacing Russia in some of its key markets, India moving away from dependence on Russia, and China moving towards self-sufficiency have all been at least a decade in the making and do not appear to be reversing course. France's unique ability to offer a third way to customers who want Western quality without vulnerability to American arms sanctions is a fundamental and increasingly successful challenge to at least half of the Russian arms industry's export model. Russia's future as an arms producer will have to rely on the other half of their export model, producing cheap weapons. But even on this front, Russia may find itself facing stiff competition from Franco-Indian collaborations and will certainly struggle to compete with the rising Chinese arms industry. Ironically, the past customers who kept Russia's arms industry alive after the collapse of the Soviet Union will be Russia's fiercest future competitors. But what do you think of France's rise as an arms exporter? What will it mean for the future of warfare? Let us know in the comments below, and thanks for watching. Since Russia stepped into Ukraine in 2014, escalating to a full-blown invasion in 2022, Poland's military strategy hit turbo mode. Joining NATO back in 1999, it wasn't clear Poland was gunning to be a major military force in Europe. But times have changed. Poland is on a mission, boosting its defense spending to an unprecedented 4% of its GDP by 2024. That's a bigger slice of the budget pie than any of its NATO allies are dishing out, dedicating more than half to acquiring the latest gear. But this isn't just about numbers, it's a clear signal. Poland is determined not to stay in the shadows of its powerful neighbors. With eyes on becoming the leading military force in Europe, Poland is upping its game, investing heavily in modernizing its arsenal. But ambition and reality don't always align smoothly. As Poland gears up, let's dive into the transformation of its forces, the goal to become Europe's top dog in defense, and challenges this ambitious leap forward entails. Poland isn't just another piece on NATO's chessboard, it's a key player. But what makes it stand out? As Europe's sixth largest economy and the heavyweight on NATO's eastern flank, Poland's role is more than just national defense. It's about being a steadfast guardian for its smaller allies, like the Baltic states. The nation's military strength is not merely for show, it's a critical component of NATO's collective security, offering crucial support to those on the front lines of potential conflicts. Geography shapes destiny, especially in military terms, and Poland's prime location serves as a crucial chess piece in NATO's strategic playbook. Here's why. Poland sits on the southern side of the Suwalki Gap, the roughly 100-kilometer border between it and Lithuania that straddles the trajectory between the heavily fortified Russian enclave of Kaliningrad in the west and Moscow's vassal state of Belarus in the east. A strong Polish military is therefore crucial to the security of the Baltic states, as a pincer movement between Kaliningrad and Belarus could cut them off from their NATO allies by land. Although Sweden's official entry into the alliance in March 2024 has since relieved some of the security pressures by opening an alternative route of supply and reinforcement through the Baltic Sea. Even without such a pincer movement, Poland faces threats from both the north and east in Kaliningrad and Belarus, both of which host some of Russia's nuclear weapons on their respective soils. The Poles do not have the luxury of being buffered as the Western European countries in NATO do. Warsaw must have a strong military to provide deterrence and, if need be, self-defense. The Polish military in some ways resembles Ukraine's, with a mixture of Western and Soviet-era equipment, although because of its long-time NATO membership, Poland is in a stronger starting position to complete its modernization and integrate the new equipment with modern doctrine. As of January 2024, the Polish military is ranked 21st out of 145 countries listed in the Global Firepower Index. Its current military is composed of 202,100 active personnel and 350,000 in reserve. Poland plans to increase the size of its active duty army to 300,000 by 2035, which would make it the largest army in Europe. The new troops will enable Poland to create 6 armored divisions. In comparison, France and Germany only have 2 of these, while the United Kingdom has just 1. There is an additional 50,000 paramilitary troops for Warsaw to call upon. In the event of a wider confrontation which calls for conscription, Poland has a total population of about 40 million, with 18.6 million in available manpower reserves. Of these, 15.2 million are considered fit for military service. About 455,000 people reach military age on an annual basis. According to the Global Firepower Index, Poland has 612 tanks in its fleet, with 459 of these being ready for service. Poland is gradually discarding the Soviet-era tanks in its stockpile, which have proven less than optimal for modern warfare. Instead, it's donating these tanks to Ukraine and using the funds for its military buildup to buy 366 Abrams tanks from the United States. 250 of these will be the newest variety, the M1A2 SEP version 3. The remainder will be of the older but still capable M1A1 FEP variety. In addition to the American Abrams, Poland is also ordering 1,000 K2 Black Panther main battle tanks from South Korea. An initial batch of these tanks have been delivered to Poland as of 2022, and the rest of them will have been delivered by 2025. Poland has obtained a license from the South Koreans to produce 820 of the tanks from domestic manufacturers. The license will be valid for 10 years and be a welcome way for Warsaw to increase its homegrown defense manufacturing capability. Indeed, voices within the country are warning that the domestic defense industry should not be allowed to atrophy because of all the purchases of foreign military equipment. The South Korean license helps to ensure that outcome will be avoided. Poland has 13,956 other military vehicles in service, with 10,467 of these being ready for a deployment. Poland plans to add 1,000 of its domestically produced Borsuk infantry fighting vehicles to its fleet, alongside an additional 400 auxiliary versions, i.e. specialist vehicles based on the Borsuk chassis design. Warsaw's order of these units is meant to replace the Cold War-era BWP-1, a domestic redesign of the Soviet BMP-1. The Borsuk has a remote-controlled turret armed with a 30mm cannon and 2 launchers for Spike LR anti-tank guided missiles. As a secondary armament, the Borsuk comes with a coaxial 7.62mm machine gun. The vehicle is capable of amphibious operations and propelled by 2 water jets in such conditions. It can cross lakes and rivers while remaining afloat. The price tag is about $6.6 million per unit. Here's something you may not have known before. Poland is already ranked 15th in artillery on the Global Firepower Index. Although it's lacking in towed artillery with 0 pieces, it has 525 units of self-propelled artillery, such as its domestically produced 155mm Crab howitzer. 394 of its self-propelled artillery pieces are considered to be ready. It plans to add 648 South Korean K9A1 self-propelled howitzers to this force. The new units would place Poland at number 10 on the GFI's listing of global artillery power. In terms of rocket artillery systems, Poland has 211 MLRS units, with 158 of them being fit for duty. Warsaw is planning to supplement this force with 500 American HIMARS systems and 288 South Korean Chunmoo MLRS systems. Such a force will bring Poland's ranking in the related index from 25th to 5th, even surpassing the United States at its current ranking of 7th with 694. It's unclear if Poland plans to add any towed artillery units into its military. While Poland is traditionally a land power by geographic necessity, it's not neglecting its naval forces as part of its arms buildup. Poland can afford to rely more on its allies in the Baltic, something which Sweden's entry into NATO, in particular, enhances greatly, but it does not want to take any chances. Poland's navy is small, with 45 total assets. Most of these consist of its 21 mine warfare ships. It has 2 frigates, as many corvettes, 3 patrol vessels, and 1 submarine. Poland plans to add to this force. 3 new Michnik-class frigates are on order in a $3.8 billion deal struck between the Polish military and the British defense contractor Babcock. The 3 new frigates will be based on the Royal Navy's Type 31 design. The British expect the Type 31 to enter service by 2031. These frigates will carry a crew of 105 sailors and displace about 6,000 tons. The Type 31's main armament will consist of 32 cells for various types of missiles. To back the missiles up, these frigates will also be armed with a 57mm gun and 2 40mm guns. 12.7mm machine guns serve as ancillary weapons. Poland isn't aiming to build a blue water navy like the United States or even the United Kingdom and France, but that's because it recognizes its needs, which are to provide security in the Baltic. Poland's new frigate will serve in their purpose of being part of NATO's local naval capabilities. The new ships will also be prepared as part of a NATO force to counter the new ships Russia is commissioning into its navy, which also tend to be lighter frigates and corvettes, as its heavier Soviet-era destroyers and cruisers gradually get retired. Moscow cannot afford to build adequate replacements, as seen with the troubled Lyda-class destroyer project. To support its army and navy buildup, Poland is also looking to the skies. It ranks 26th in the world's air fleets, with a total of 468 aircraft. 351 of these are considered fit for service. 59 of these aircraft are fighters, and 44 of them are ready for deployment. Many of Poland's fighter aircraft are Soviet-era 4th-generation fighters like the MiG-29. Warsaw has steadily donated these aircraft to Ukraine and is building an air force of modern fighter jets. It already has 48 upgraded F-16C fighters in its arsenal. It plans to have at least 32 F-35 Lightning II aircraft as part of its vision for the new Polish Air Force. The F-35 fleet in particular will make Poland the sentinel of NATO's eastern frontier and give it an advantage over any Russian air attack. The F-35 purchases will mean that Poland has more 5th-generation fighters than even Russia, which has only acquired 22 Su-57 Felon aircraft as of December 2023. Russia plans to get to a fleet size of 76 of these aircraft in the coming years, but because of sanctions, this will be a difficult challenge. The F-35 is also far stealthier than the Su-57, giving the Polish fleet an advantage in modern long-range air battles. Poland plans to acquire an additional 48 Fa-50 Golden Eagle light aircraft from South Korea. The Fa-50 can serve as a supersonic trainer to transition Polish pilots to the F-35, but that's not all this aircraft can do. The Fa-50 Block 10 and Block 20 fighters that Poland has ordered have improved systems, such as the ANAAQ-33 Sniper targeting pod, manufactured by Lockheed Martin. This device permits far more offensive capabilities for the Golden Eagle, such as the ability to deploy laser-guided munitions and beyond-visual range air-to-air missiles, such as the AIM-120 AMRAAM, the Meteor, and potentially the AIM-260 JATM. At shorter ranges, the FA-50 can use the AIM-9 Sidewinder series in the air and various types of air-to-surface missiles for ground attack missions. For even longer-ranged ground attack missions, the South Korean military has begun reviewing whether it will be possible to arm the Golden Eagle with a variant of Germany's Taurus air-launched cruise missile. If it's possible, the Poles would likely show great interest. These missiles have a range of about 500 kilometers and give the Poles the ability to threaten Kaliningrad and Russian bases in Belarus from afar. In addition to fighter aircraft, Poland has 34 attack aircraft, with 26 of these being considered ready by the Global Firepower Index. Poland has 49 transport aircraft, with 37 fit for service. It has 107 trainers, with 80 of them being considered fit, although this number will go up thanks to the arrival of the FA-50. Poland has no aircraft refueling tankers, which limits the range of its air force, although these are not needed for Poland's defense-centric mission. In the worst case, Warsaw might think that it can rely on its American ally to provide these services. There are 9 special mission aircraft in the Polish Air Force, with 7 being fit for service. Finally, the Poles have a fleet of 215 helicopters, which ranks them 21st in the world. 161 of these helicopters are ready for service. 30 of the helicopters are attack varieties, which ranks Poland 20th in the world. 23 of these aircraft are considered fit for service. That number is about to shoot up in a major way. In September 2022, Poland ordered 96 AH-64E Apache helicopters from the United States in a contract worth $12 billion. This is enough for Warsaw to create 6 helicopter squadrons. Poland will also be boosting its air defense systems, something which the war in Ukraine has proven to be an urgent necessity, since the country's existing systems are mostly composed of outdated Cold War-era equipment. Warsaw plans to purchase $5 billion worth of Patriot air defense missiles from the United States, with 2 batteries of 16 launchers in the first phase. In the second phase, Poland will receive 6 additional batteries with improved radar offering 360-degree coverage. To further strengthen its air defenses, the Poles have made an initial order for $2.4 billion worth of British CAM missiles. Poland's 3 new frigates will also be capable of launching these missiles. Poland is also looking to improve its shorter-range air defenses. As part of this project called Naru, the Polish military will receive 23 short-range air defense batteries, comprising a total of almost 400 launchers with missiles that can hit targets between 25 and 50 kilometers away. The Ukrainians have shown in recent months that these systems can also be used in an offensive capacity. Deploying them strategically near the front has allowed Ukraine to shoot down 11 Russian aircraft in 11 days in February 2024. If Russia was hesitant to use its aircraft against the Ukrainians, Poland's new air defense systems will be that much more of a deterrent for Moscow's plans. Because of Poland's economic growth, it's in a much better position to afford a modern military than the rest of its NATO allies in Eastern Europe. However, that does not mean that the new armament program will be easy for Warsaw to handle, and there is no guarantee of success in the way the Polish government envisions. For example, just because Poland desires to spend a lot of money on acquiring new equipment does not mean it will easily be able to integrate it into its armed forces. Training and adjustment will come with their own challenges. The money is also not guaranteed. Paying for the new firepower will be challenging despite Poland's newfound wealth, even with a $2 billion loan from the United States. $60 million of this American loan is provided as foreign military financing, which supports urgent procurement of defense articles and services from the United States. This $60 million will help to ensure that Poland can get more favorable terms for the total loan, but we will need to see if it can actually do so. Poland also recently experienced a change in government, with the previous ruling Law and Justice Party losing a few dozen seats in the country's parliament and Donald Tusk emerging as the new prime minister as part of a coalition. The military buildup was a central policy of the previous government. The previous deputy prime minister, the influential Jarosław Kaczyński, had planned on spending as much as 5% of the country's GDP on defense within the next decade. Although the invasion of Ukraine has made the necessity for a strong defense clear, especially for the historically aware Poles, it remains to be seen if the new government will carry through the build-up to the extent that the Law and Justice Party had planned. Perhaps the bigger challenge that comes with the military build-up for Poland is what Warsaw will have to give up in exchange for the increase in the capability of its armed forces. The new military spending, Zolder warns, by necessity assumes an increase in GDP. While Poland has averaged a growth rate of nearly 4% since the end of the Cold War in 1991, that's not guaranteed to remain the case over the time span that Warsaw envisions for its arms buildup, especially since GDP growth tends to decline once a country is more developed. In 2024, the International Monetary Fund estimated that Poland's GDP would grow at a rate of 2.5%, significantly down from earlier projections of 3.1%. Zolder's report also warns that Poland's level of military spending would see other priorities go unmet, with weaknesses in the healthcare and education sectors in particular. Inflation is also a problem. In January 2023, Poland had reached an inflation rate of a staggering 17.2%. Such high price increases add to political instability and questions the feasibility of such a large increase in military spending at the expense of civilian sectors of the economy. In his report, Zolder also raises doubts about the viability of the second source of funding for the military buildup, which is Poland's Armed Forces Support Fund. This entity is supposed to issue bonds to raise the money needed to make the equipment purchases and recruit the new troops. While there do not seem to have been problems with raising the money so far, one cannot guarantee that investors will be eager to buy such bonds forever. Perhaps the most challenging aspect of Poland's military buildup is in the recruitment of the personnel needed to fill the ranks and operate the new systems. Poland's population is shrinking. Demographers with the World Population Review expect Poland's current population of about 40 million to shrink to about 38 million people by 2035, the date Poland aims to complete the recruitment of its new 300,000-man active army. However, recruiting these new soldiers could be a challenge, and there will be a steadily shorter supply of available manpower in the coming years. The country's changing demographics will also require a proportional greater share of the national wealth to be spent on elder care, leaving less money available to support the military. Poland's rush to expand its military power in response to recent geopolitical developments is understandable. Its history with Russia is long and painful, and it's the most significant NATO country on the alliance's eastern flank. Its rapid military buildup would see it re-emerge as Europe's sentinel opposed to an expanding Russian presence, a task it was forced to carry out as late as 1920, when it stopped the expansion of Soviet Bolshevism into Eastern Europe with its crushing victory at the Battle of Warsaw that summer. Poland intends to make sure that it can do such a thing again. There is no doubt that the Polish military will be much more capable than it was by the end of the 2020s compared to when the decade began. Significant obstacles remain in the way of Poland acquiring as much military power as it wants to, however. What do you think of these obstacles? Will Poland be able to become the most powerful military on the European continent within the next decade, as it intends? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons to support the channel and for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out how Poland is preparing for full-scale war against Russia, or click this other video instead. In January 2024, NATO kicked off Steadfast Defender 2024, an exercise so massive it's been dubbed the biggest military shuffle since the legendary Cold War Reforger maneuvers of 1988. This isn't just any routine drill, it's a historical behemoth marking NATO's grandest display in the post-Cold War era. With new members on board and tensions in Europe simmering, this exercise has all the ingredients of a high-stakes military drama. For the first time, Sweden flexed its muscles alongside NATO powers as a fully fledged member, expanding the scope and intensity of the alliance's maneuvers. But as you might guess, not everyone's throwing a party over this. Putin has been eyeing these developments with more than a little unease. In today's video, we're diving deep into Steadfast Defender 2024. We'll break down the nuts and bolts of the exercises, explore Russia's chilly reception, and unpack the strategic moves that have led NATO to ramp up its game. Buckle up, it's going to be an intriguing ride through modern military history. Let's get started with a quick overview. Steadfast Defender began on January 22nd and will end on May 31st. It involves all 32 NATO countries, including Sweden, which formally joined the alliance as the operation was underway. 90,000 troops will take part in this drill, which will span the entirety of NATO's territory from North America to the Russian border. General Christopher Cavoli, NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Europe, stated that Steadfast Defender would be a demonstration of the alliance's ability to reinforce the entire Euro-Atlantic area, including through transatlantic movements of forces to counter the threat of a near-peer adversary. In other words, this exercise would simulate a combined response to a Russian attack on a NATO country, almost certainly in Eastern Europe. Poland, the Baltic, Germany, Norway, and Romania are therefore major areas for the exercise's operations, as all of these places are considered vulnerable to a Russian attack. In outlining the overall goal of the operation, Cavoli stated, "Exercise Steadfast Defender 2024 will be a clear demonstration of our unity, our strength, and our determination to protect each other, to protect our values and the rules-based international order." American units participating in the Steadfast Defender exercise include the U.S. Second Fleet, Green Berets, and Marines. According to the U.S. Department of Defense, over 50 total naval assets are taking part in Steadfast Defender, along with more than 1,100 combat vehicles. These vehicles include over 150 tanks, 500 infantry fighting vehicles, and 400 armored personnel carriers. Aircraft included are F-35s, FA-18s, F-15s, and Harrier jets and helicopters. 20,000 troops from the United Kingdom are also among the participants. 16,000 of these are from the British Army, with much of the activity coming from the 7th Light Mechanized Brigade Combat Team, which has taken its tanks, artillery, and helicopters with it. Other British Army units in Steadfast Defender 2024 include the Commando Helicopter Force, 16th Air Assault Brigade, and 16th Armored Brigade Combat Team. 2,000 sailors and 400 Royal Marines from the Royal Navy are participating as well. A British carrier strike group centered on one of the two Queen Elizabeth-class aircraft carriers and its assortment of F-35B fighters is taking part in exercises in the North Atlantic, North Sea, and the Baltic. 15,000 of the troops in Steadfast Defender are from Poland, 10,000 are from Germany, an additional 5,000 are Dutch. The Steadfast Defender exercises are meant to be the first large-scale test of NATO's new defense plans that were approved at the Alliance's summit in Vilnius this year. According to NATO, Steadfast Defender 2024 is based on a fictitious Article 5 scenario triggered by a fictitious attack against the Alliance launched by a near-peer adversary. The Alliance's official website has detailed a timeline that offers an overview of all the sub-exercises in Steadfast Defender and their purposes. According to NATO, the first part of Steadfast Defender is focused on securing the Atlantic up to the Arctic. Live maritime exercises and amphibious assault drills are a big focus for this phase. The second part of Steadfast Defender is focused on moving troops through Europe. Troops and equipment will be deployed rapidly across national borders as part of this phase. The exercise began on January 22nd in Norfolk, Virginia. That city hosts NATO's Joint Command Force Norfolk, which is coordinating the first phase. American forces would be departing from there on that date, while Canadian forces would set off from Nova Scotia soon afterward. Between February 11th and 20th, NATO conducted maritime live exercises to test its ability to secure lines of reinforcement and communication across the Atlantic. According to the Alliance, these drills, called MARCOM LIVEX, were conducted primarily off the Spanish coast. The next set of exercises, called Brilliant Jump, took place between February 12th and 28th. These tested the NATO response force's ability to plan and execute rapid deployments, including standby readiness during peacetime. These exercises were based in Germany and Poland. Then came Joint Warrior, led by the United Kingdom, where it primarily took place between February 24th and March 3rd. These drills emphasized maritime and offshore maneuvers in conjunction with air and land operations. Exercise Dragon 24 came between February 25th and March 14th. This one was led by Poland as part of a unilateral effort to train all branches of its armed forces to respond to crises. About 20,000 total troops from 10 NATO countries participated in Dragon 24. All of the 15,000 Polish troops in Steadfast Defender took part in the exercise. Sabre Strike 24 just started in April 2024 and is being led by US Army Europe and Africa. This set of exercises is also part of Part 2 and takes place from April 8th to 30th in Germany, Poland, and Lithuania, and it's putting emphasis on rapid deployment and cold weather training in the Baltic area. From February 29th to March 14th, NATO troops participated in Trojan Footprint 24, a drill that focused on improving the integration and interoperability of member states' respective special operations forces. Bulgaria, Georgia, Germany, Greece, North Macedonia, and Romania were the main host countries for this drill. About 2,000 special operations troops from Albania, Bulgaria, France, Georgia, Greece, Italy, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Portugal, Romania, Spain, the United Kingdom, and the United States participated in the exercise. The United States contributed about 900 of those troops. The Green Berets were known to participate in airborne operations alongside Greek paratroopers as part of the exercise. The Trojan Footprint exercise has occurred annually since 2002. The Crystal Arrow set of exercises took place between March 4th and 15th. Latvia was the host country for these drills, and the Latvian Mechanized Infantry Brigade led them. The purpose was to practice alert procedures and evaluate the readiness of NATO's multinational battle group Latvia. The Nordic response drills occurred between March 3rd and 14th. As the name implies, the purpose of this drill was to increase NATO's ability to address challenges in the extreme north. Finland and Sweden's entry into the alliance expanded these exercises. This drill involved over 20,000 troops, 50 ships, and 110 aircraft from 14 NATO countries. The next on NATO's list is Defender 24, scheduled for the span of April 8th to May 31st, and organized by the United States European Command. This exercise involves deployment of forces over distances stretching from North America to US EUCOM's area of responsibility, with Northern Europe as the primary focus point. Defender 24 tests NATO's ability to receive, stage, and deploy these forces in Europe. Defender 24 is the foundation for other exercises like Sabre Strike 24, Immediate Response 24, and Swift Response 24. Immediate response will occur between April 21st and May 31st. The United States will lead this exercise that's designed to boost the interoperability of NATO countries. The Hungarians will lead the Brave Warrior exercises between May 1st and 22nd and will include all forces in NATO's multinational battle group Hungary. Its purpose is to increase the training for this battle group to lead international operations and plan and conduct defensive operations. Spring Storm will take place in Estonia between May 12th and 31st. It's that country's largest annual military drill and will be led by one of the Estonian Defense Forces infantry divisions. It will focus on joint defensive operations with other NATO units. The aforementioned Swift Response 24 will occur between May 14th and June 14th, therefore going over the time technically allotted to the broader Steadfast Defender exercise. The United States will lead this drill and focus on joint airborne operations. Poland, the Baltic states, and Georgia will be the primary staging grounds. Finally, there is the German-led Grand Quadriga exercise, set to take place between April 30th and July 30th, running well over the allotted time for Steadfast Defender. Germany and Lithuania will be the primary staging grounds. The Grand Quadriga drills will focus on deterrence and NATO's defense posture. Taken together, we see that the Steadfast Defender 2024 exercise will simulate multiple types of combat across the entirety of NATO's territory, implying that it will test the alliance's ability to fight a war across a broad front resembling the World Wars. Though NATO made carefully worded statements to stress that Steadfast Defender was not directed against any country, Russia is the only one that fits the bill of being able to create the scenario the alliance was training to counter. A NATO official, quoted by the US Department of Defense, admitted that the alliance was closely watching the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and incorporating its lessons into plans to improve training, capabilities, and innovation. Policymakers in Moscow were not fooled either. Before the exercises began, Russia's foreign ministry claimed that NATO was conducting a demonstration of force on Russia's doorstep. Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister, Alexander Grushko, called Steadfast Defender the irrevocable return of the alliance to Cold War hostility. Another spokesman for the Russian government, Dmitry Peskov, said that the exercises were quite unprecedented and that NATO was making no attempt to hide the fact that they were aimed against Russia. On February 5th, former Russian President and Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev warned on social media that there was a potential for a big war with NATO, and said that Steadfast Defender 2024 came as a result of Western politicians who have shit their pants. Their mediocre NATO generals have once again decided to scare us. Medvedev insisted that Russia would never strike first against a NATO country, but that it would be prepared to respond to an attack against its own integrity or increased NATO association with Ukraine. Not coincidentally, Vladimir Putin himself traveled to Kaliningrad shortly after Steadfast Defender began. According to the Institute for the Study of War, the Russians have done more than complain about Steadfast Defender. They have tried to undermine it. On January 20th, before the exercises began, the ISW accused Russia of conducting an information operation to misrepresent the NATO exercise. According to the ISW, the Kremlin's information operation against Steadfast Defender came in several dimensions. Firstly, it tried to portray the drills as a provocation on the part of NATO. This cannot be the truth because the exercise is based on a simulated Article 5 scenario. Article 5 in the North Atlantic Treaty is by law defensive in nature. The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all, and consequently they agree that, if such an armed attack occurs, each of them, in exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense recognized by Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations, will assist the party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith, individually and in concert with the other parties, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. The North Atlantic Treaty, therefore, establishes that NATO is a defensive alliance. It does not cover the scenarios of a member provoking or aggressing against another country. Article 5 cannot be invoked for such purposes. The Steadfast Defender exercise also came in direct response against Russia's increasing provocations, not only against Ukraine, but against former members of the alliance. A case in point can be found in leaked Kremlin documents that were composed in the fall of 2021 by Russia's Directorate for Interregional Relations and Cultural Contacts. These documents were leaked to Swedish media in May 2023. They revealed that Russia would attempt to increase its influence over the Baltic states and reduce NATO's presence there between 2022 and 2030. In the short term, Russia sought to create new centers of influence, like NGOs, to promote closer cooperation between the Baltic states and itself, and preserve historical memory by stopping the demolition of Soviet-era monuments. NATO and its relations with the Baltic states is a key area of focus for the Kremlin. Stopping NATO's plans to build a permanent base in Lithuania by 2030, the militarization of Lithuanian territory, as the relevant document called it, is one of the plan's primary concerns. By 2030, Russia also aims to get the Baltic states to reverse course in their opinion on NATO. Through opinion-shaping operations, the Kremlin aims for the Baltic states to come to view NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe as potentially damaging to their national security. As such, Russia wants to stop their increasing cooperation with NATO's forward presence in Eastern Europe and gradually restore ties with these former Soviet states, including military ties. Russia plans to foster pro-Moscow politicians in the Baltic states and take advantage of the presence of the sizable ethnic Russian minorities in Estonia and Latvia. Although the documents outline plans for Russia to use soft power methods like the promotion of cultural ties and increase of cross-border investments, Moscow plans to use harder methods too. One of these is to stop the Baltic states from leaving the treaty that synchronizes their electric grids into a shared network with Russia and Belarus. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are in the process of integrating their power grids with Europe. The Baltic states plan to complete this process after a test at the end of 2025, and from that point forward, abandon the shared grid with Russia and Belarus. The Russian documents identified this plan as a threat. These documents are similar to the ones Russia drafted concerning Belarus, which some believe is an annexation plan. It is likely that the officials who wrote these documents did not know that Putin had plans to invade Ukraine, as there were no such hints, and many of their theories seem much more outlandish now than even in 2021. Nevertheless, the documents outlined Russia's general attitude of disrespect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states that had once been within the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire. Tellingly, Russia explicitly mentioned the Baltic states when responding to the NATO drills. According to the Kremlin, the alliance was using the Steadfast Defender exercise to wind up and provoke the Baltic states into a war with Russia. This is the attitude that NATO's Steadfast Defender exercises were designed in response to. It's not a coincidence that these exercises came after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the revelation of these sorts of plans. Russia's rhetorical attempt to shift the narrative to NATO being the aggressor is not only a bid to escape scrutiny for its aggressive actions, it can also be seen as a way to shape the information environment for future moves against the Baltic states, as Moscow may claim that it's responding to a potential attack. In general, Putin has identified and viewed the Western powers as his and Russia's enemy, and his response to Steadfast Defender was not the first time he has attempted to create this information environment. He has repeatedly claimed that he is fighting in Ukraine because of Western aggression and threats against Russia. According to the ISW, recent Russian electronic warfare exercises in Kaliningrad may have also been more of a grey zone operation than a strict exercise. These exercises took place between December 25th and 27th, 2023, and again between January 10th and 16th, 2024. The Russian exercises reportedly caused unprecedentedly high GPS jamming in northern and central Poland, as well as in the southern Baltic area. It's in this context that NATO decided to conduct the largest exercise since the Cold War. While Steadfast Defender has gone smoothly so far, the exercise comes at a time of peril for the alliance. Russia is gaining momentum in Ukraine, albeit at a high price. The Russian military has suffered enormously, but has adapted to developments on the battlefield, including with the use of drones. NATO countries have also shown vulnerability. On the day before Steadfast Defender began, the alliance reported that it would miss its overall target for spending 2% of GDP on defense, as most of the members would not hit that mark. While NATO members have increased their defense spending since 2014 and pledged to greatly increase military expenditures following the invasion of Ukraine, only 11 of the 32 members of the alliance spent at least 2% in 2023. More are expected to reach the goal this year, including Montenegro, North Macedonia, Denmark, and the newest NATO member, Sweden. However, Western European countries continue to fall short of the target, testing America's patience in the process. During a bitterly partisan presidential election, experts warn that Western Europe is running out of time to get its act together. While President Biden has been more patient, he is deeply unpopular at home, and both of his immediate predecessors were far more critical of NATO countries being free riders. There is no guarantee that his successor, whoever it is, will be as patient as he is. Furthermore, Russia has been more resilient in the face of sanctions than many in the West had hoped for. Russia's economy survived the temporary shock and has transitioned to a war footing. Russia has kept pace with productions of tanks, vehicles, missiles, and other pieces of military hardware. Meanwhile, many NATO allies have low stockpiles of ammunition, which have been further stressed in supplying Ukraine. This reality has caused officials from Germany, Belgium, and Sweden to warn that NATO allies have a short window to prepare for a potential war with Russia. Admiral Rob Bauer of the Netherlands, the chairman of NATO's military committee, warned that the West has grown too accustomed to peace and needs to be more prepared for conflict, which will involve the whole of society, whether we like it or not. This reveals the purpose of Steadfast Defender 2024. NATO allies are working together in a series of maneuvers of unprecedented size to prepare for a potential war, and Russia's conduct toward NATO's members and the alliance as a whole has only reinforced the need for preparedness. The results of Steadfast Defender will undoubtedly be discussed and analyzed at the 2024 NATO summit to be held in Washington between July 9th and 11th. These results will likely be the foundation for future exercises and a general transition of the alliance toward a state of further readiness for conflict. Overall, Steadfast Defender is a sign of the times. NATO officials have warned that Western countries had become complacent in the belief that history had ended in 1991. That was not the case, and now the alliance must relearn the skills and acquire a state of readiness that had been allowed to atrophy. Do you think Steadfast Defender exercises will assist NATO in its preparedness? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. All Swedes should mentally prepare for war. That was the message Michael Biden, the Supreme Commander of the Swedish Armed Forces, sent loud and clear on Swedish international broadcaster TV4 in January 2024. This message, or should we say warning, was just one of the ominous statements made by Biden. Another one, previously made on the same platform, hints at why Sweden is preparing for war. Russia's war against Ukraine is just a step, not an end game, Biden warned. As you can imagine, these nationally broadcast proclamations have plunged the nation into a state of anxious anticipation. This is best seen in a 3,500% increase in visits to the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency's web-based bomb shelter map and a 900% rise in downloads of the agency's information booklet titled "If Crisis or War Comes." However, these proclamations also made us pose the question, will a war in Scandinavia come? After all, with the largest population and the highest gross domestic product, GDP, by a margin, Sweden is often considered the most powerful and influential among the Scandinavian countries. So if Sweden is seemingly gearing up for a war against Russia, will all Scandinavian countries follow in its footsteps? That's what this video will look into. It will also dissect how ready Scandinavian nations are for war. After all, a heightened mental state of readiness means nothing if the physical and logistical aspects of preparedness are lacking. But before we go any further, we must define the Scandinavian nations we'll be discussing. Why? Because people often confuse the term Scandinavia with the broader concept of the Nordic countries. A sub-region of Northern Europe, Scandinavia primarily refers to Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. However, though not geographically part of Scandinavia, Finland is often listed as a Scandinavian country due to its cultural and historical ties to the region. The country's ties to Sweden in all matters, civil and military, are what makes Finland particularly relevant for this video. So as far as we're concerned, Finland is part of Scandinavia. This also makes it a part of countries potentially preparing for war against Russia. But why? Now, don't get us wrong, it's not like Russia and Scandinavia have had this beautiful allyship and friendship throughout history. Even calling these nations friendly might be a stretch. However, there haven't been any explicit mentions of wars between these countries in recent history. So, what changed? The answer is simple. Russia invaded Ukraine. With most Scandinavian countries being relatively close to Russia, Finland even shares an 832-mile-long border with the country, they basically have a front row seat to the atrocities unfolding in the region. But Scandinavian countries aren't looking the other way. On the contrary, they're laser-focused on what's happening to Ukraine and what could happen to them. Just days after his bone-chilling warning on national television, General Biden shocked Swedes once again, this time at the Folk och Försvar annual national conference, the foremost meeting place for the Swedish security and defense policy community. General Biden showed a series of gruesome photos from the front lines of the Russo-Ukrainian war, with snowy fields as a backdrop. As these haunting photos alternated, he asked a single question: "Do you think this could be Sweden?" From this question alone, it's easy to conclude that Scandinavian countries are being confronted with the stark possibility of a conflict hitting close to home. In other words, they are preparing for war, as they believe a war is coming their way. A similar sentiment was echoed by Sweden's Prime Minister, Ulf Kristersson, at the same conference. His exact words were, "Our destiny is playing out in Ukraine. The struggle to remain who we are and dare to believe in ourselves. Ukraine is facing an existential threat. This is a threat that we share." However, this threat has certainly achieved one thing. It aligned all the Scandinavian countries on security. That's why Sweden and Finland joined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, after years of self-imposed neutrality. This can also be considered a reason as to why Scandinavia is preparing for war against Russia. It now has a united front in the face of a perceived national threat. Though Sweden and Finland's accession to NATO is crucial for the war in Ukraine, this war isn't the only reason behind their decision. The situation in the Arctic has also been a driving force. Now, to be fair, the tensions in the high north have been primarily caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. However, given everything on the table in the Arctic region, it shouldn't be surprising that the Arctic question has now evolved into a distinct and separate geopolitical concern. You see, all 4 Scandinavian countries are among the 8 Arctic nations. In other words, they have territories in the Arctic region. But do you know which country is also an Arctic nation? That's right, Russia. With Sweden and Finland joining NATO, the remaining 7 Arctic nations, the so-called Arctic 7, are now geopolitically aligned. Therefore, they outnumber Russia 7-1. Given the mighty military most prominent Arctic nations boast, it only makes sense for the Scandinavian countries to up their game and be ready for a potential conflict. But how truly ready are these countries for war with Russia? A quick comparison between Russia's and Scandinavia's military capabilities should answer this question. Spoiler alert, even when combined, Scandinavian countries don't even come close to Russia in most aspects. Take the country's military budgets as an example. Sweden spends the most on defense among the Scandinavian nations, which is about $7.6 billion, or 1.3% of its GDP. Norway is next with $7.3 billion, which is 2% of the country's GDP. Finally, we have Denmark with $4 billion and Finland with a $3.3 billion military budget. Russia alone spends $65.9 billion on defense. And that's not all. The Russian government intends to spend as much as $160 billion on defense, which would surpass 10% of its GDP. To say that this figure dwarfs the combined military budgets of all Scandinavian countries might be the understatement of the century. Unfortunately, similar discrepancies can be seen in virtually all other military areas. For instance, Sweden, Finland, Norway, and Denmark have less than 100,000 active military personnel combined. Russia alone boasts roughly 1 million. However, things do look up a little in the reserve military department, as the Finnish defense forces maintain a sizable reserve force of about 900,000 personnel. Add the 31,300 from Sweden, 63,000 from Denmark, and 40,000 from Norway, and Scandinavia can at least muster over half of Russia's 2 million reservists. Regrettably, the same can't be said for any of the military equipment in these countries' army, navy, and air force. Let's do a quick overview to help you understand just how huge the difference between these potential war players is in this department. Since Russia shares quite a lengthy border with one of the Scandinavian nations, let's tackle the land forces first. First up, tanks. Russia boasts over 12,000 tanks, while the Scandinavian nations have under 500 together. With 200, Russia's neighbor Finland has less than half this number. Scandinavia has slightly better odds in the armored fighting vehicles department, as Denmark has over 4,000, Sweden and Finland over 2,000 each, and Norway over 550. But then again, Russia has over 24,000 of these vehicles on its own. As for the artillery, we're back to abysmal figures. Russia's total artillery strength is approximately 18,266, a far cry from Scandinavian assets, which at best go over 800 in Finland. Now you might think these numbers aren't really relevant, as a vast majority of Russian land forces are deployed in Ukraine, and that's absolutely right. However, its air and sea forces remain intact. So let's take flight for a second, though you'll probably want to land again as the situation in the sky is even more lopsided. Russia boasts an impressive fleet of almost 4,500 aircraft. This figure includes 1,665 helicopters, 689 attack aircraft, 340 fighter aircraft, 384 multi-role aircraft, and 100 unmanned combat vehicles, UCAVs. As for Scandinavia, the total number of aircraft between all four countries is just under 600. The breakdown is even more dreary, as the Scandinavian countries don't possess the same aircraft capabilities. However, these countries are well aware of this fact. That's why in March 2023, Sweden, Finland, Norway, and Denmark moved to create a unified Nordic air defense and significantly strengthen its numbers. To this end, Norway ordered 15 more F-35 fighter jets to add to its existing 37 ones. Finland has 64 F-35s on order and 62 FA-18 Hornet jets in store, and Denmark will add 27 F-35s to its fleet of 58 F-16 fighter aircraft. So the situation in the sky seems somewhat optimistic, but what about the sea? If we take our hypothetical battle to the sea, Scandinavia might stand a chance, as its total number of naval assets is almost 500 compared to Russia's 653. However, in areas where numbers truly matter, such as aircraft carriers, destroyers, and submarines, Russia wields significant superiority. The Scandinavian countries, on the other hand, either have none of these crucial vessels or fall in the single-digit zone. Though these numbers sound bleak, the worst is yet to come. No Scandinavian country possesses a single nuclear weapon. In contrast, Russia has roughly 6,000, placing the country at the forefront of global nuclear capabilities. Of course, we must note that the absence of nuclear weapons in Scandinavia is intentional, reflecting a long-term commitment to being a nuclear weapon-free zone. Still, this doesn't change the fact that Russia is very much a nuclear weapon-armed zone, and a dangerous one at that. With all these facts and figures in mind, one thing becomes abundantly clear: Scandinavia alone could never stand up to Russia. But luckily, Scandinavia isn't alone. The region's alliance with NATO is nothing short of game-changing and is sure to boost Scandinavia's odds in a potential war. Just remember what Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty states. The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. Article 5 allows NATO allies to assist the attacked country by taking forthwith, individually and in concert with other NATO allies, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force. For now, Article 5 has been invoked only one time, after the September 11th terrorist attacks on the US. However, the mere existence of this article provides solid insurance for member countries. That's why this article can serve as a sufficient explanation of why Sweden and Finland chose to abandon their policies of neutrality after decades and join NATO. Of course, Norway and Denmark have long waited for their Scandinavian neighbors to join them in NATO, as these countries have been a part of the alliance since its very inception. In fact, Norway and Denmark are among the 12 founding member countries of NATO. With this in mind, let's briefly discuss the cooperation between NATO and the Scandinavian countries to understand the importance of all four nations being a part of the alliance. First up, Norway. Norway has been quite an active NATO member since the alliance's formation. It participated in several NATO operations, including the 1999 bombing of Yugoslavia and the 2011 military intervention in Libya. The country also sent troops to Afghanistan following the September 11th attacks. Norway's national delegation to NATO includes high-status personnel from the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Defense. However, when it comes to Russia, Norway has followed a reassurance policy since the Cold War, limiting the presence of NATO past the 28th longitudinal zone, close to the Norwegian-Russian border. Of course, it's highly unlikely this policy will hold under the new geopolitical circumstances. The next in line is Denmark, a country that went from being neutral for decades to becoming a founding member of NATO. How is this possible? Well, it's simple. Following 2 world wars, Denmark stopped viewing neutrality as foolproof security assurance and opted to consider other solutions. The first option emerged between the 2 world wars, and it involved joining all the Scandinavian countries, plus Iceland, in an alliance. After all, these countries shared centuries of history, similar democratic values, and a strong culture of consensus building. Unfortunately, World War II forced them to shelve these plans and ultimately pushed Denmark to NATO. However, the country only joined NATO on 3 conditions. Number 1, NATO won't establish permanent military bases in Denmark, with the exception of Greenland. Number 2, NATO will respect Denmark's commitment to a non-nuclear weapon policy. Number 3, there will be no allied military activity on the entire territory of the Danish kingdom. Interestingly, these conditions also had something to do with Russia, or to be precise, Russia's predecessor, the Soviet Union. With these conditions, Denmark hoped to present its accession to NATO as strictly a defensive measure and not a provocation to the Soviet Union. However, as time went by, Denmark took a more active and confident role in NATO. In the 1950s, the country was involved in NATO's Northern Command, together with Norway. In the 1970s, it became part of the Stanav Forchan, Standing Naval Force Channel, NATO's permanent maritime presence in the English Channel. During this period, Denmark also participated in NATO's Trans-European Radar System, which was designed to provide air defense in a supersonic age. Afterward, Denmark fully embraced its role with the alliance and made NATO the cornerstone of its defense. However, throughout all these years, Denmark's northern neighbors, Sweden and Finland, remained neutral. Though to be fair, Finland was neutral significantly less time than Sweden. The country only adopted this policy during the Cold War era, especially after World War II. Its neutrality also ended sooner, as Finland became a member of NATO on April 4, 2023, almost a year after applying for membership. By the end of 2023, the country signed bilateral military agreements with the US, allowing its personnel and weapons at dozens of Finnish bases, including some in the Arctic. Finland's NATO membership almost doubled the length of the alliance's border with Russia. But what is arguably the most fascinating part of Finland's evolution regarding NATO is the incredible shift in public opinion toward the organization. As recently as December 2021, more than half of Finns opposed joining NATO. In November 2022, 78% of them were in favor. This stunning reversal just goes on to show that the Finnish people see NATO as the only way to protect their country against Russia. If we were to travel west, we'd see that nearly 60% of Swedes shared the same opinion about NATO as of 2022. Though this figure might be considered significantly lower than that of Finland, it's still monumental for a country that was neutral for more than 210 years before joining NATO. That's right, the last time Sweden was involved in a war was in 1814, when it briefly fought a fellow Scandinavian country, Norway. Since then, Sweden has pursued a policy of non-alignment in peacetime and neutrality in wartime, as the Swedish government puts it. Still, throughout the years, Sweden strived to maintain close relationships with NATO members without explicitly joining the organization. However, as Russia brutally invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Sweden realized this wasn't enough. So Sweden applied for NATO membership at the same time as Finland. Of course, Finland was also one of the major driving forces behind this decision, as these two nations have historically worked closely together on virtually all issues. Now you might wonder, if Sweden and Finland applied for NATO membership at the same time, why did Sweden have to wait to become a member nearly 1 year after Finland? 2 countries are to be blamed for Sweden's painstaking journey to NATO: Turkey and Hungary. Both countries defended their decision to withhold membership based on the hostile attitude Sweden had displayed toward them in the past. Since Turkey and Hungary have since ceased blocking Sweden's entry to NATO, we won't spend too much time delving into the real reasons for this delay. We'll only leave you with a couple of facts. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has historically maintained quite a close relationship and collaboration with Russia's President Vladimir Putin. At the same time, Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, who has been in power for 14 years, is often referred to as Putin's mouthpiece by his critics. You can draw your own conclusions. But let's focus on the more positive aspects of this story. Sweden finally became a NATO member on March 7, 2024, and according to many experts, NATO is precisely where Sweden has belonged all along. After all, Sweden connects the Baltic region to the transatlantic link and can play a key role in deploying and transporting Allied combat forces. But will Allied combat forces need to be deployed through Sweden and the rest of Scandinavia? In other words, how likely is it for a fully fledged war to break out between this region and Russia? If we were to look for an answer in the past, it would probably be very likely. After all, Russia and Scandinavia, and for that matter, the newest NATO members, Sweden and Finland, haven't had the best history. Going back to the 17th and 18th centuries, the Russian Empire kept trying to conquer Finland, which was a hinterland of the Swedish Empire at the time. However, the Swedish Empire settled the score by invading and conquering parts of the Russian Empire in the early 18th century under the command of King Charles XII of Sweden. Unfortunately, the victories were short-lived, as Tsar Peter the Great defeated King Charles, marking the end of the Swedish Empire as a major power in Northern Europe. At the beginning of the 19th century, Russia even took Finland from Sweden, turning it into the Grand Duchy of Finland, an autonomous part of the Russian Empire. As mentioned, Sweden embraced a policy of neutrality shortly after, in 1814, but remained a vocal critic of the Russian Empire's subsequent iteration, the Soviet Union. As many Swedes will tell you, Russia has always been perceived as an enemy. The same can be said for Finns, who consider Russia a serious security threat. And how could they not? After all, Finland and Russia fought battles on several occasions, including the Winter War. After World War II, Finland lost roughly 10% of its territory to the Soviet Union, which forced it to relocate 11% of its population, about 400,000 people. The country also had to pay approximately $300 million in war indemnities, which is as much as $5.3 billion at current exchange rates. Though the subsequent period was focused on avoiding any potential conflicts with Moscow, nothing can erase history. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Scandinavian people have had the chance to remember why they dislike Russia, as the country started using a series of grey zone tactics in the region. These tactics refer to sly and unconventional moves made to provoke a nation without crossing the threshold into open armed conflict. For example, in November 2023, Finland had to close its borders to Russia after a massive surge of asylum seekers. Finnish Prime Minister Petteri Orpo labeled this move as instrumentalized immigration in retaliation for joining NATO. Gunilla Herolf, a senior associated research fellow at the Swedish Institute for International Affairs, also claimed that Russia has the ability to stop Sweden from functioning through cyber attacks and sabotage operations if it chooses to. But let's go back to the primary question. Will Russia and Scandinavia cross this odd threshold they currently navigate and go into an open-armed conflict? Truthfully, it depends on who you ask. Those who believe that a war is imminent think so because of how unpredictable Putin has become. Plus, Russia's president is seemingly determined to create a new Europe, one where might is right, as Pål Jonson, Sweden's Minister of Defense, puts it. That's why Jonson believes that a Russian attack on Sweden can't be ruled out. However, others believe that Russia won't attack Sweden. But don't be fooled, this doesn't mean that there won't be an attack. It only means that Russia's target will be another Scandinavian country, Finland. This possibility primarily has to do with Finland's long border with Russia, which creates numerous opportunities for border clashes that can escalate in no time. And let's not forget, after Finland was accepted into NATO, Russian officials warned that this country would be the first to suffer in case of any conflict between Russia and NATO. However, those who believe no conflict will erupt in Scandinavia write off these threats as nothing but posturing. They believe that Russia has already lost too much in Ukraine to start another war in Europe. Of course, this war wouldn't be in anyone's best interest, as it could have severe consequences for all parties involved, and let's face it, the entire world. But Scandinavia isn't the only potential war zone when it comes to Russia. The Arctic region has attracted many a troubled gaze for this very reason. In his 2023 speech at the Arctic Circle Assembly, Rob Bauer, the chair of the NATO Military Committee and Lieutenant Admiral in the Royal Netherlands Navy, stated, "We must be prepared for military conflicts arising in the Arctic." Still, many experts believe that a full-blown military conflict in the Arctic won't likely take place or be instigated by Russia. After all, Russia has too much to lose in the far north, thanks to all the military equipment stationed in the Arctic and the country's numerous resource-extracting projects. But then again, we're talking about Putin, a man who never knew when to admit defeat. If backed into a corner by the growing might of NATO, who knows how Russia's unpredictable and unreliable president might react, especially when you consider that any potential for diplomatic dialogue has long ceased to exist in Russia's case. But what do you think? Were the Scandinavian bombshell warnings just that, warnings? Or are we bound to see actual bombs flying around soon? Or do you think that NATO and the Scandinavian alliance will deter Russia from initiating full-scale military operations in the region? Share your opinions in the comment section below. Now go and check out why Finland joining NATO destroys Putin. Or click this other video instead. There could be war in Sweden. Those are the words of Carl-Oskar Bolin, Sweden's civil defense minister, and they were spoken to the attendees of a defense conference in January 2024. Worse yet for Sweden, Bolin's isn't the only voice in the country that's warning its citizens to prepare for war. The commander-in-chief of the military, General Michael Biden, not only backs up what Bolin said, but builds upon it, saying that all Swedes should prepare mentally for the possibility of war. Against who? Putin, of course. The comments caused an uproar in some parts of Sweden and panic in others, with the country's former Prime Minister, Magdalena Andersson, objecting to the warning while pointing out that it's not as if war is just outside the door. Elsewhere in the country, a children's rights organization named BRIS reported that its national helpline has started to see an uptick of worried calls from children asking about a potential conflict, as well as an increase in TikTok posts talking about it. Before Bolin's statement, BRIS received none of these types of calls. But to Bolin and Biden, as well as many of the more military-minded people in the country, the call to prepare wasn't only necessary. It was a wake-up call, one designed to shock the Swedish system to ensure it's prepared for Putin if and when he lands on their doorstep. The question now is simple. Why is Sweden preparing for war with Russia? After all, Putin has his hands full in Ukraine, and though the taking of Avdiivka does give him a certain military advantage, it's likely he'll be embroiled in that conflict for at least the rest of 2024, if not longer, depending on the level of support that Ukraine receives from its Western allies. But it's that very war that provides us with our first reason why Sweden is starting to prepare to fight Russia. In the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Europe woke up to the fact that it has a territorially minded leader on its doorstep who's willing to invade other countries to stake his claim to land that he believes belongs to Russia. And since Putin's war with Ukraine began, NATO has been an ever-present thorn in his side. Ukraine wants to join, guaranteeing protection from NATO's members and forcing them to enter the conflict due to Article 5 of the organization's charter, and many other countries are starting to see the benefits of being part of the military alliance. After all, it's better to be part of a group that can combine forces to fend off Russia than to be on the outside while hoping that members of that group will provide financial and military aid. Sweden recognizes this. That's why the country's lawmakers officially ratified and approved its bid to join NATO on March 22, 2023. With that approval in hand, Sweden now had a clear path to becoming part of the Union, bolstering its defenses in the process, right? Not so much. Though NATO invited Sweden to join the group during its Madrid summit in June 2022, paving the way for the new laws in Sweden allowing the country to apply, it took almost 2 years for the country to become a fully fledged member. Hungary, which already has ties to Russia, stood in its way as the only country that refused to approve the proposal to have Sweden join. Worse yet for Sweden, it faced no definitive timeline on when it would be able to join NATO following its invitation. Hungary's president claimed that he'd need to hold a meeting with Sweden's leadership in Budapest before he'd provide his approval. What do all of these NATO wranglings have to do with Russia? According to NATO, not much at all. In speaking about Sweden's membership, NATO claims that Putin indicates he sees little to no threat to Russia if Sweden joins the group. His issue would come if NATO then starts to build military infrastructure in Sweden or neighboring Finland, the latter of which shares an 830-mile border with Russia and became a NATO member in April 2023. Publicly, Putin and his cronies have been far more overt in their warnings. In April 2022, just a few months prior to NATO extending its hand to Sweden, BBC News reported that a Kremlin spokesperson named Dmitry Peskov told reporters that NATO remains a tool geared towards confrontation. He went on to make a more sinister claim, saying that Russia would have to rebalance the situation should Sweden and Finland join the group. Finland was already a member before the creation of this video, and finally, after months of wrangling, Sweden officially joined the NATO family on March 7, 2024. Of course, both will have taken note of Peskov's comments when they were made, with their desire to join NATO likely being a counter to his rebalancing. The question, of course, is what does rebalancing the situation mean in this context? To Russia, NATO is a domineering force, not only in Europe but the entire Western world. It's the propagator of the Western world order and a group that prevents Putin from achieving his geopolitical aims. In short, Putin believes that NATO places global geopolitics out of balance. allowing them to favor the group's members via the collective military power and the bargaining might that comes with it. Rebalancing could simply mean that Putin would seek to build stronger alliances with other anti-Western countries such as China. There's evidence Russia is doing just that, especially in last year's BRICS expansion, which saw Iran join the loose economic alliance, while both Russian and Chinese influence grew in the organization. But the other way to interpret these rebalancing comments would be that Russia may invade Finland and Sweden in response to their NATO membership, especially if that membership results in the countries hosting infrastructure he believes could damage his ambitions. After all, it's not like Russia and Sweden don't have a history. Territory has long been a sticking point between the two nations, even with Putin's June 2022 claims that Russia doesn't have the same sort of territorial quarrel with Sweden that it has with Ukraine. When doing so, Putin even went as far as to claim that Sweden, as well as Finland, could join whatever group they wanted. Of course, that claim came alongside yet another threat to meet the building or deployment of military infrastructure in either country if the time came. However, we also know that territorial rights, both modern and ancient, are high on Putin's agenda. The same goes for history and war, which he covered extensively during his February interview with Tucker Carlson. That bizarre interview began with Putin delivering an extensive lecture on his own interpretation of European history, which he used as justification for his invasion of Ukraine, and talks about Kievan Rus, a medieval superpower country that included Ukraine and Belarus's territory as well as Russia's. That focus on history would have scared many in Sweden because the country has its own long-standing history of war with Russia to look back on. Take a trip back to the 19th century. And you see Russia pulling moves that are eerily similar to what they're doing today in Ukraine. The year was 1807, and the great French Emperor Napoleon was running roughshod throughout Europe. The year prior, he defeated Prussia to secure his hold on what we now know as Germany, with his next goal being to close all economic ports to Britain. This would cut the island nation off from Europe economically so he could starve it out and achieve an easy victory. That's where Russia comes into play. By June 1807, Napoleon had taken Friedland, which opened the way for him to advance on Russia. Pushing the Russian lines back to the River Aller, Napoleon exerted his nation's power before calling the Russian Tsar, Alexander I, to a meeting in order to negotiate peace. Rather than battling a treaty out, the two emperors found themselves fascinated with one another, to the point where they started drawing up plans for a new world order. Part of those plans included dividing Europe up into Russian and French regions, with the task of cowing Sweden into joining this new joint continental empire falling into Russia's hands. In return for taking Sweden, Russia would receive Finland, which was Swedish territory at the time. Digging into the war that followed could fill an entire video, so we won't do it here. The key information you need to know is that Sweden and Russia fought viciously, with both achieving major victories, though Russia ultimately started to come out on top. To avoid losing more of its territory, Sweden entered negotiations with Russia in September 1809, with the result being that Russia annexed Finland and the Åland Islands. The annexation ended nearly a 600-year-old union between Sweden and Finland, essentially setting the stage for the latter to become its own country. Russia held influence in Finland for over a century following these negotiations, only leaving the country in 1917, a year before the end of the First World War. During this occupation and period of control, Finland began to develop its own national identity, even to the point where it was granted autonomy within the Russian Empire of the time. However, the Bolshevik Revolution put paid to Finland's relationship with Russia, serving as the trigger for it declaring its independence in December 1917. Almost 18 months later, the US recognized Finland as an independent nation, and the formation of the Scandinavia that we know today was completed. That story is relevant because it shows that Sweden and Russia have a military history. In most cases, that history would mean little. The war between the two, which resulted in Sweden's loss of Finnish territory and the creation of a completely new country, was over 2 centuries ago. Its ancient history, with Sweden and Finland both long being recognized as separate entities in the 21st century. But if there's anything that Putin's conversation with Carlson has showed us, it's that Russia's leader is willing to twist history to justify his own actions. He did it to Ukraine. Now both Finland and Sweden may fear that he'll do it to them. After all, the nations aren't only linked in their desire to join NATO, they've also teamed up to fight the Soviet Union in more recent history. In 1939, Finland began to suspect that the Soviet Union intended to annex the country once again, taking back the control it had lost a little over 2 decades prior. For its part, the Soviet Union feared Finland's proximity to its borders, suspecting that the nation could be used by others as a base from which its enemies could attack in the future. That fear sounds rather similar to Putin's worries about Finland and Sweden becoming NATO members. Regardless, Finnish suspicions were confirmed in November of that year when the Soviets invaded the tiny nation just 3 months before Adolf Hitler's fateful invasion of Poland. What followed was a 3.5-month war, during which the superior might of the Russian army was somehow repelled by Finland's comparatively meager forces, at least for a brief time. Finland managed to put up this resistance with the help of Sweden, which provided military aircraft during the brief conflict. Though this initial loss damaged Russian morale, the Soviets came back later with a better organized army. Finland, already exhausted from the early battles of the short-lived war, eventually decided to enter negotiations with the Soviet Union. The Treaty of Moscow was signed, seeing the Finnish cede 11% of their territory to Moscow, and another war pitting Sweden and Finland against Russia had ended. Sit tight, we're not quite coming back to the present day just yet. During the Second World War, Sweden cleverly positioned itself as a neutral entity, knowing that it didn't have the military strength to repel the combined Axis forces. That positioning allowed it to be a vocal critic of both the Soviet Union and the US, though it was far warier of Russia behind the scenes. According to Reuters, the end of the Second World War and the increased power of the Soviet Union in that war's aftermath made Sweden suspect that it would soon face a Soviet invasion of its own. So from the 1960s up until the last couple of decades, Sweden had a secret deal with the US that the latter would come to its defense should it ever face that invasion. Other incidents that created tension between Sweden and Russia included the downing of a pair of Swedish aircraft over the Baltic Sea in 1952, an act for which the Soviet Union didn't claim responsibility until 1991, and the Whiskey on the Rocks incident. That saw a Whiskey-class Soviet submarine run ashore on the southern Swedish coast, with Swedish authorities of the time claiming the sub emitted enough radiation to suggest that there was a nuclear device on board. Fast forward to 2024, tensions between Russia and Sweden have eased considerably from their Cold War peak. However, Putin's threats of aggression related to Sweden's desire to join NATO ring similar to the reason why Russia invaded Finland during the Winter War. Both are close to Russia's borders, with Finland sharing a border, and both could become sites of the very military infrastructure that could cause retaliation from Russia. Add to all of this Putin's now established trait of using the past to justify his actions in the present, as we see in Ukraine, and the possibility of a Russian invasion of Sweden no longer seems so far-fetched. It may not be a priority for Putin, but with Sweden now part of NATO, it's positioned itself as an enemy of Russia, at least in Putin's eyes. Even if that membership doesn't come with the caveat of allowing NATO to build military infrastructure on its territory, Sweden has still joined forces with what Russia claims is one of the most domineering groups in the world. And given that Sweden, along with Finland, are essentially right on Russia's doorstep, it's possible that Putin will turn his threats into a reality should he come out on top in Ukraine. And if that war happens, it may not start with troops on the ground. Instead, it might start with cyber attacks. According to the International Trade Administration, or ITA, Sweden is one of the world's most well-connected countries. Over 98% of its population are hooked up to the internet, with most having access to smartphones and making use of remote access to work and play. But that connectivity creates a problem. Ransomware attacks have been on the rise in the country, growing by 144% between 2019 and 2023. Sophos Sweden, which releases an annual cyber attack report for the country, claims that it's one of the most exposed in the world in terms of the number of attacks it suffers and how much those attacks cost companies. Now think about it in these terms. If Sweden is so vulnerable to cyber attacks on the business level, how prepared do you think its relatively underfunded military would be to fend off even more sinister attacks aimed at its infrastructure? Not well enough, according to Säkerhetspolisen, the Swedish security service. It points out that Sweden's military buildup creates a greater risk of cyber attacks, especially given that it involves an increasing number of entities falling under the country's national security scope. It specifically cites shortcomings in protective security, claiming that Sweden's total defense capability risks being compromised while it's being built up, if nothing is done to remedy the issue. Of course, there's one nation that's known for exploiting cybersecurity vulnerabilities: Russia. According to the National Cybersecurity Center, we saw Russia's use of cyber attacks in action just 1 hour before its invasion of Ukraine. UK and US intelligence officials agree that the country launched an operation targeting a Ukrainian commercial communications company named Viasat, with a particular focus on the country's military. The attack also affected wind farms throughout much of Central Europe, in addition to cutting off internet access for many in Ukraine. It would be inaccurate to say the attack paved the way for Russia's invasion. It would have happened anyway, but it certainly disrupted communications at a time when Ukraine's military needed to be able to organize its defenses against the invasion. So we see yet another reason for Sweden to prepare for war with Russia. Beyond its NATO membership and the territorial claims that Putin likely believes he has, Sweden is vulnerable enough on the cyber level to make an attack by Russia a real possibility. Of course, all this leads to another question. If Sweden believes that it needs to gear up for war against Russia, what's it doing to prepare? The first and most obvious answer comes from its new membership of NATO. By joining that military alliance, Sweden now falls under the protection of 31 other countries thanks to Article 5 of the NATO Charter. That article states that any attack by a non-NATO country on a NATO member's soil will be considered an attack on all members. In other words, should Russia invade Sweden, it'll be able to call on the combined military might of 31 other countries, including the United States, to come to its defense. That alone might be enough to dissuade Putin. However, Sweden isn't taking any chances. In addition to its NATO membership, Sweden has upped its military spending considerably. In September 2023, Reuters announced that it would add 700 million crowns to its military budget, approximately $68.5 million, bringing its spending up to 119 billion crowns, or about $11.6 billion in 2024. That number amounts to around 2.1% of the country's gross domestic product, or GDP, bringing it in line with NATO's 2% recommendation and demonstrating that Sweden is willing to invest big in its fighting forces. But even before that announcement, Sweden had been on a military spending spree. In April 2023, the country ordered 20 Pansarterrängbil 300 vehicles from Finnish manufacturer Protea. These 6x6 armored vehicles were purchased under the Common Armored Vehicle System program, of which Sweden became a member in 2022. Capable of carrying up to 12 people, they feature a modular design that allows them to be configured for purposes as varied as ambulance duties and command and control. 2 months later, Sweden inked a deal to purchase 3,000 MUV 4x4 vehicles from Italian manufacturer IDV, all of which will become part of the Swedish armed forces and meet the country's need for light multi-purpose vehicles that it could use on the battlefield. And in September 2023, the country also signed on the dotted line with BAE, a British manufacturer, to purchase around $500 million worth of Archer artillery delivery systems. Speaking of Ukraine, Sweden isn't ignoring its importance in a potential war with Russia. After all, if Ukraine is able to stop Russia in its tracks, that victory would minimize the threat that Putin poses to Sweden. That's likely why the 20th of February 2022 brought with it an announcement from the Swedish government that it would donate an additional $693 million to Ukraine, the 15th support package it's delivered to the country. So Sweden is flashing the cash to boost its military. Granted, it's not spending nearly as much as Russia, which increased its military spending to $160 billion in 2023. But this spending is a clear sign of intent. Sweden knows it needs to be stronger, and it's willing to buy what it needs to shore up its defenses. That, combined with its NATO membership, makes the country a strong threat to Russia should Putin decide to invade. But there's more. The country has also taken steps to reintroduce conscription. In 2010, Sweden did away with its military service program, which was a holdover from the Cold War period, leading to a drastic reduction in the country's armed forces. That lack of conscription only lasted for 8 years though, with the program being reintroduced in 2018. At that time it was essentially voluntary. However, the war in Ukraine, coupled with Sweden's NATO application, caused it to rocket up. In 2023, conscription rose by 30%, with Al Jazeera reporting that the country plans to raise its conscription numbers to 10,000 by 2030. The country's Prime Minister, Ulf Kristersson, shared the prevailing sentiment that inspired the move when speaking to the National Conference of Defense in early 2024. Sweden can't sit around investigating things year after year. Now it's important to get things done. It certainly isn't sitting around anymore. Sweden is now a NATO member. It's spending more on its military than it has in decades, and it's using conscription to bolster its numbers and create a generation of Swedes who are trained and capable of entering combat should the situation call for it. The one thing it stopped short of is reintroducing its nuclear program. In 1945, immediately in the wake of World War II and the dropping of nukes on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, Sweden created a nuclear research program. It spent the next 2 decades researching how to develop these powerful weapons, though there's no evidence that it was ever able to assemble a nuclear device. By the mid-1960s, around the time it created the secret defense deal with the United States that we mentioned earlier in the video, Sweden decided to end this program, becoming a signatory of the Non-Nuclear Proliferation Treaty in the process. It doesn't intend to break that treaty. In an April 2023 post discussing its then proposed entry into NATO, Sweden confirmed its commitment to nuclear disarmament. It won't build nuclear bombs, despite the fact that Russia has them. But frankly, it doesn't need to. Now that it's a NATO member, it's allied with France, the US, and the UK, all nuclear powers that are bound by Article 5 to come to Sweden's defense should Russia ever attack on Swedish soil. All of this leads us to a final question. Could Sweden fend off, or even defeat, Russia if war ever comes? If fighting alone, it would likely stand no chance. The Russian war machine is so powerful that even if Sweden could turn the fight into the battle of attrition we're seeing in Ukraine, it would likely be overcome. But Sweden isn't alone. It's now part of a military alliance that will join in its fight if it ever finds itself at war with Russia. Putin will be fuming, and he'll be even angrier if Sweden allows NATO to build military infrastructure on its territory. But unlike Ukraine, which isn't a NATO member and doesn't benefit from Article 5 of the NATO Charter, Sweden now has allies who are duty-bound to join the fight, rather than simply support it with funds and equipment if Russia ever invaded. Now we'll turn the questions over to you. Do you think Russia will actually invade Sweden? What would happen if Russia and Sweden did go to war? Tell us what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out why Finland joining NATO destroys Putin, or click this other video instead. Aggression against Belarus will mean aggression against the Russian Federation. We will respond to it with all means at our disposal. That was the stark warning Vladimir Putin delivered to Poland in July 2023. It came after tensions started mounting between Poland and Belarus, with the latter's military making strange moves that culminated in Poland rushing troops to its eastern borders in August 2023. Ostensibly, this was to shore up defenses after accusing Belarus of violating its airspace with its military helicopters. That move also came in the wake of comments from Belarus's leader, Alexander Lukashenko. The pro-Russian leader was quick to taunt Poland when mercenaries from the infamous Russian Wagner Group arrived in his country, telling Poland that those mercs were stationed near the border the two countries share. For its part, Belarus claims that the helicopter violations didn't happen. Its defense ministry posted on Telegram that Poland's statement wasn't backed up by data coming out of the country, going so far as to say it was treating Poland's claims in the same manner as an old wives' tale. Still, it's clear that tensions exist. And if those tensions boil over, leading to Poland launching an attack on Belarus or vice versa, they would likely lead to an all-out war between Russia and Poland. So the question we pose in today's video is simple. If Poland and Russia go to war, who would come out on top? On the surface, it seems like any war would result in a fairly easy victory for Russia. It certainly has the advantage in pure numbers, both in terms of troops and equipment, when stacked up against Poland side by side. Remember the story of David and Goliath? If that tale caught your interest, you're going to want to hear what's next. We're about to dive into some surprising elements, including the introduction of new weaponry, upgrades to existing arsenal, and 240 Leopard tanks. Let's dive into what Poland, our proverbial underdog, is truly facing first. And remember, in the fog of war, appearances can be deceiving. According to Global Firepower, or GFP, Russia is the second strongest military power in the world. Poland falls a fair distance behind, coming in at 21st in GFP's ranking of 145 countries, and it certainly doesn't have the manpower to compete with Russia. Its army is less than a sixth of Russia's size, with Poland boasting 202,100 active personnel to Russia's 1.32 million. Poland does have extensive reserves, with 350,000 people ready to join its active military if the need came, but so does Russia. A staggering 2 million people sit on Russia's military bench, meaning it will be capable of bringing 3 million troops to the fight compared to Poland's 552,100 if a war broke out. Bad news for Poland. We also can't forget the paramilitary side of the conflict. Russia is littered with independent fighting cells and mercenary groups, including the aforementioned Wagner Group, that technically operate independently of Moscow but are likely to join the fighting in a war with Poland. Those groups add another 250,000 to Russia's numbers, while Poland only has 50,000 paramilitary forces. Cast your eye onto the equipment side of a war, and Russia comes out on top again. It has nearly 10 times the air power of Poland, with over 4,200 aircraft in its fleet compared to Poland's 468. That includes a substantially higher number of fighters, 809 to Poland's 59, and almost 10 times more transport planes. Russia also has 559 attack helicopters to Poland's meager 30, and 136 more planes designated for special missions. On land, Russia blows Poland out of the water with sheer numbers too. It has 14,777 tanks compared to Poland's 613, as well as over 140,000 more armored vehicles. Russia has thousands more towed artillery units, as well as more than 5,500 self-propelled artillery units, along with 2,800 more mobile rocket projectors. The picture being painted doesn't look any prettier for Poland from a naval perspective. Russia's massive fleet numbers 781 ships, meaning it has the world's largest navy. Poland's 45 ships leave it at 53rd in the world, with Russia having more aircraft carriers, submarines, destroyers, frigates, and corvettes. The only place where Poland even comes close to competing is in the mine warfare stakes, as almost half of its navy, 21 ships, are dedicated to planting mines in its waters. But even then, Russia comes out on top, as it has 47 mine warfare units. All signs point to an easy victory for Russia. Poland essentially shares two borders with Russia, the Kaliningrad exclave and Poland's border with Belarus, which Lukashenko would likely be more than happy to allow Putin to use in a war with Poland. Plus, Poland's flat geography means that Putin would be able to maximize his superior ground forces, mobilizing thousands of tanks in the process to attack Poland. But the victory wouldn't be as easy as it seems. In fact, if war were to break out between Poland and Russia, Poland would likely dominate the conflict to the point where Putin is sent back to Moscow with his tail between his legs. At this juncture, you're probably asking yourself how that could be possible. Poland's military is weaker in every way, so it would surely have no chance of repelling Russia's forces. How could it possibly win? The answer starts with one key advantage Poland has over Russia: its diplomatic ties. Over the past few years, Poland has been working hard to shore up its defenses, both militaristically and in terms of its relationships with other countries. Starting small with relationships, it's recently started to rebuild the long-dormant Weimar Triangle, a military alliance between France, Germany, and Poland. The Weimar Triangle was created in 1991 with the intention of boosting cooperation between the three countries. That cooperation extends beyond the military, with all three sharing scientific and cultural achievements. It was through this group that Poland created the Weimar Battle Group in 2011, giving it a unit of 1,700 specially trained soldiers that would operate under its command. But through much of the 2010s beyond that, the Weimar Triangle lay dormant, with cooperation between the three key European states being somewhat limited. Now the triangle is being rebuilt. In February 2024, Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk journeyed to Paris to speak to France's President Emmanuel Macron before moving on to Berlin to meet with Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor. His goal was simple: start rebuilding relationships with two countries that had long been allies. Those relationships have been cold since 2016, with the German Marshall Fund of the United States, or GMFUS, claiming that temperatures with Berlin were polar, thanks in large part to Poland's previous leaders using hardline and often anti-German rhetoric to achieve political victory. That era of Polish politics ended with the rise of Tusk, who is much more willing to cooperate with his allies in Berlin, meaning the Weimar Triangle is in the process of defrosting. It's believed that Tusk's meetings in Paris and Berlin focused on clarifying the security and defense architecture of Europe. So a good diplomatic start, perhaps, but the revival of a long-dormant military alliance is far from enough to stop the Russian war machine. Besides, if Putin decides to invade Poland, the Weimar Triangle doesn't guarantee that France or Germany will come to Warsaw's aid. That's very true, but Tusk's efforts to thaw out the Weimar Triangle are indicative of his work to strengthen Poland's ties with the rest of Europe. For years, Poland's PIS party used anti-Europe rhetoric to achieve political dominance in the country. It got so bad in the run-up to the October 2023 elections that saw Donald Tusk rise to power. Tusk claimed that PIS would work to take Poland out of the European Union if it were to achieve a victory that would see it lead for a third term. PIS denied this, claiming it had no interest in a supposed Polexit. However, in the wake of Putin's war in Ukraine, the anti-Europe rhetoric the party used to rise to power was no longer as appealing as it had once been. Recognizing the need for unity with potential military partners, Polish voters started to stray away from PIS. Following the October elections, PIS still held the popular vote, just. It came away with the majority of votes, though it didn't receive enough seats to win outright. It needed a coalition to form a government. It couldn't form one. That set the stage for Tusk and his Civic Platform party to team up with the Third Way, a centrist right party, to take control in Poland. That coalition's stated aim is to maintain Poland's security in the wake of rising Russian aggression. PIS claimed the same, however Tusk's approach is far more pro-Europe, as the former Civic Platform party leader Danuta Hübner points out. She now serves as an MEP in the European Parliament, as well as serving as Poland's former Europe minister, and her message was clear in an October 2023 interview with France 24. Poland is back in the European Union and in the world, and the real Poland, democratic Poland, is also back. The idea of Polexit is gone. That's huge for Poland's chances in a war with Russia. With its relationship with the other 26 members of the European Union, or EU, being rebuilt, Poland will be able to rely on the organization to support it should it enter a war with Russia. But again, that support may not come militarily, at least not directly. It's far more likely that the EU would offer financial support, along with sending military equipment into Poland to support its war effort. We'd also likely see the EU implementing sanctions against Russia should war arise. It's already used sanctions to great effect in relation to the war in Ukraine. Thus far, the EU's restrictive measures have been applied to 419 Russian entities, as well as 1,706 individuals, including Putin himself and many of his high-ranking officials. Those sanctions extend to Russia's banks, political parties, and even some of its paramilitary forces, such as the Wagner Group. Combined, this has led to about $23.5 billion in Russia's assets being frozen in the EU, with over $328 billion in assets owned by the Central Bank of Russia being blocked within EU and G7 countries. The EU may not be able to go much further in terms of the level of sanctions it's implementing, but it could certainly extend them even if Putin's war in Ukraine ends, should Russia start a fight with Poland. So we're slowly starting to see Poland's strategy for dominating Russia, at least diplomatically, emerge. The revival of the Weimar Triangle saw it reform what could be a powerful military alliance with France and Germany. And with Tusk now serving as Prime Minister, Poland's relationship with the EU will improve to the point where it will be able to rely on it to implement sanctions and provide financial aid, at the very least in the event of a Russian invasion. But Poland has one more diplomatic string to its bow: NATO membership. In 2019, Poland celebrated its 20th year of NATO membership. It's a membership that's still going strong, with 70% of the country's people believing that it has improved the country's security, and as a NATO member, Poland benefits from Article 5 of the NATO Charter. Why is that important? Article 5 states that any armed attack on a NATO ally is considered an attack on every other member of NATO. In response to that attack, NATO's members agree to take whatever action they deem necessary to counter the attack. Those measures include, though aren't limited to, the use of force to defend the member that has come under attack. It's essentially the Three Musketeers approach, all for one and one for all. If a Russian invasion of Poland took place, Putin wouldn't just have Poland to contend with. It would also have 31 other countries, most with strong militaries of their own, that would join the war. Those countries include the United States, one of the few in the world that can match or exceed Russia's sheer military might, meaning Poland's diplomatic ties would ensure that it can defend against and likely repel a Russian attack far better than Ukraine has managed. Poland is also one of the biggest contributors to the NATO purse. In fact, according to the World Population Review, it's the biggest contributor, at least in terms of the percentage of GDP spent on defenses. In 2021 alone, Poland spent 3.9% of its GDP on its military, with the US coming in second at 3.49%. So if Russia invaded Poland, then the United States would have to stand with the rest of NATO members to defend it. Poland's position is already looking much better. Though Russia has the advantage in sheer size and military strength when fighting Poland alone, it can't compete with all of NATO. Even if the US was the only nation to enter the war in Poland's support, Russia would likely be destroyed. But there's more. Beyond its many diplomatic advantages, Poland also has the upper hand in some militaristic aspects that could help it to win. One of those advantages lies in the country's geography. Earlier we told you that Poland is a fairly flat country, which would make it a good candidate for invasion by Russia's enormous fleet of tanks. That is indeed the case, with Russia also being in a position where it could utilize two borders with Poland to launch its invasion, its own and the border Belarus shares with Poland. However, Russia would be limited to that ground-based approach. Above Poland lies the Baltic Sea, which is part of the Atlantic Ocean but is essentially enclosed and surrounded by multiple countries. Russia and Belarus are two of those countries, potentially providing a naval approach into Polish territory. However, the other countries that border the Baltic Sea include Poland, Sweden, Germany, Finland, and Denmark, all of whom are NATO members. If Russia wants to bring its 781-vessel-strong navy to bear against Poland, it has to run a sea-based gauntlet of NATO member countries that would buffet it from all sides. The combination of those countries would come close to putting Poland's navy on par with Russia's. After all, Finland has 246 naval assets, with Sweden owning 353, potentially adding almost 600 ships to Poland's defenses before we even consider Germany and Denmark. Of course, not all of those ships, on either side, would enter the Baltic Sea. But thanks to its NATO alliances, Poland would essentially be able to blockade the one seaborne passageway into the country that's open to Russia, potentially fighting Putin's navy to a standstill and preventing him from using Poland's ports as a possible entry route. That would limit his invasion to the borders Poland shares with Belarus and Kaliningrad, which Poland could turn into choke points with the help of its NATO allies. Add to all of this Poland's September 2023 agreement to purchase 4 Naval Strike Missile Coastal Defense System squadrons, which come with several hundred missiles from Kongsberg Defense and Aerospace, and you have a clear naval strategy emerging. Tie Russia up in the Baltic Sea with the help of its NATO allies while obliterating any Russian ships that get close to Poland with anti-ship missiles. Still, Russia has the on-land route. And though it likely wouldn't be able to get its aircraft carriers anywhere near Poland without them becoming major targets, it could still potentially coordinate airstrikes from Kaliningrad and Belarus to supplement its ground forces. Knowing this, it should come as no surprise that Poland has beefed up its military spending in recent years. We mentioned earlier that Poland dedicated 3.9% of its GDP to defense spending in 2021, making it the leading NATO contributor in terms of percentage of GDP spent. That spending represented a near doubling of its defense budget compared to 2020, and Warsaw hasn't slowed down since then. Where 2021 saw Poland spend $15.1 billion on its military, 2022 brought with it an increase of over $1.4 billion, bringing defense spending to $16.573 billion. The point is that Poland is committed to putting its money where its mouth is when it comes to defense. But granted, this spending pales in comparison to Russia's. Putin intends to plow $140 billion into Russia's military in 2024, representing a 29% rise in the country's spending in 2023, meaning Moscow has far more money at its disposal when it comes to funding a war. However, Putin also has to contend with the previously mentioned sanctions that are slowly eroding Russia's economy. Poland doesn't. In fact, its own budget will be supplemented by funds from its allies in NATO and the EU. Plus, Poland's economy is on the rise, and has been for years, to the point where it's likely to overtake Britain in terms of GDP per capita by 2030 if it's able to maintain the 3.6% annual growth it's currently enjoying. It would be inaccurate to claim that Poland can beat Russia in terms of spending. But it's not that far behind, as the figures presented suggest, especially when you consider additional funding that would come from its allies. And it has a powerful economy that will help it to sustain high spending levels if a war erupts. Beyond purchasing new arms, such as the missile systems mentioned earlier, Poland has also been spending smart by upgrading its aging military equipment so it's capable of taking on what Russia has to offer. That includes a recent upgrade to its Leopard tank fleet that will bring the 240 Leopards it has to a point where they're capable of taking out Russian tanks. That's an important move, especially if information from the national interest is to be believed. In a 2019 article, the organization pointed out that the majority of Poland's tank fleet, including the T-72M1s and other T-72 variants that make up the majority of its tank forces, would likely fall to Russia's more modern T-80UK, T-90 and T-90A tanks. The country's Leopard tanks, mostly consisting of Leopard 2A4s, wouldn't fare much better, which is why Poland is spending heavily to transform those tanks into Leopard 2PL variants. Those upgrades should keep Poland's Leopard tanks in service for around 30 more years thanks to improved turret armor packages, thermal cameras, and gun breaches. That, combined with a strategy that could see it spend more on surplus Leopard 2A4s to upgrade, could see Poland develop a tank force that's capable of taking on Russia's best in terms of technology, if not numbers, without spending as much as it would on simply buying new tanks. And again, you can add tanks that would come in from other countries to this increasingly modernized fleet to enable Poland to create a choke point across its borders with Belarus and Kaliningrad. Remember, Poland isn't looking to invade Russia. Any war that took place would be a result of Russian aggression, meaning Putin has to fight on Poland's home turf. Warsaw will take advantage of that fact by cutting off a naval invasion, leveraging its allies, and using its modernized tanks to try to pin Russia at its shared borders. That would limit the number of tanks Putin could bring to bear, giving Poland a chance to pick off ground forces as they attempt to invade. What's more, Russia's impressive military numbers hide the fact that a lot of its equipment is outdated. In an April 2023 report published by CNN, Russia will likely have to dip into its Cold War stocks of tanks and artillery to keep the war in Ukraine running. After all, it had already lost 10,000 pieces of equipment in the fighting by that point, and has likely lost much more in the 11 months since the article's publication. The loss of over 500 T-72B3 tanks by early 2023 is particularly damaging. It means Russia may have to start relying on its older tanks. And if that's all it has left when it tries to invade Poland, then Warsaw's own T-72 variants would be right back in the fight. CNN's article also brings us to the final advantage Poland would have in a war with Russia. The Ukraine war has taken a massive toll on Russia's military. Regardless of whether or not Putin eventually comes out on top in that war, it's lasted far longer than he ever anticipated. What was meant to be a smash-and-grab exercise that would see Russia take Ukraine in a matter of months has extended into a conflict that's raged for over 2 years at the time of this video's creation, and may go on for several more years if Ukraine continues to receive support from its allies. That bodes well for Poland. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Russia has already lost 414,680 troops in its invasion of Ukraine. That amounts to around a third of its active military, though the numbers aren't clear about whether they include paramilitary fighters. However, we do know that Ukraine counts around 180,000 Russian dead in those numbers, with the rest being troops that have either been injured to the point of being taken out of action or have gone missing during the fighting. Ukraine also claims to have destroyed 6,610 tanks in the fighting, along with over 12,500 armored personnel vehicles. Add to that 345 destroyed Russian planes, along with 325 helicopters and 25 boats, and you have a grim picture being painted for Russia. Of course, you may want to take those figures with a pinch of salt. They come directly from Ukraine, so there's a possibility that the numbers have been inflated. Numbers from more neutral sources, such as the International Institute for Strategic Studies, or IISS, suggest that Russia has lost close to 8,800 armored fighting vehicles, rather than 12,500 for instance. However, there's no denying one simple fact. Russia has already lost a ton of personnel and equipment in Ukraine, with much of the equipment being among the more modern stock that it has. To invade Poland now would see it relying on Cold War tech that, when stacked against Poland's modernizing military machine and the equipment it would receive from its allies, would add up to a bad outcome for Putin. To have any chance of a successful invasion, Russia would likely need to rebuild its stockpiles substantially, modernizing in the process after winning the war in Ukraine to defeat Poland. It may just do that. But the odds are that Poland will still come out on top. Combine its increasingly powerful military with the ability to create land-based choke points and essentially cut off Russia's navy, and you have a definite defensive strategy in play. Diplomatically, Poland stands on far firmer ground than Russia too, thanks to its alliances in NATO and the EU, as well as the Weimar Triangle. Should Russia invade Polish territory, it could potentially face the combined might of over 30 countries, including the United States, in response. Of course, Putin has allies of his own to call upon. China, for instance, has maintained close ties with Russia, even as the global community condemns its invasion of Ukraine. But it's telling that China hasn't directly involved itself in the war, with its support seemingly coming in the form of covertly providing some equipment to support Putin's troops. And that's against a country that isn't part of NATO. Poland's NATO membership means it can rely on major military powers such as the US to come to its aid in a Russian invasion. China will want no part of that fight, perhaps even seeing it as an opportunity to take advantage of a weakened Russia to spread its own influence. Ultimately, Russia will be able to defeat Poland in a one-on-one fight. The war would be long and would see Russia lose even more troops and equipment, but it would likely come out on top just by having the ability to throw more at Poland than its defenses could withstand. But Russia wouldn't be fighting just Poland. It would be fighting dozens of countries, all supporting Warsaw in various ways, with a depleted military, which is precisely why Poland wouldn't just win a war with Russia that starts today. Poland would dominate. But what do you think? Is Poland in such a strong position that it will be able to fend off Russian aggression? Perhaps you think that nuclear weapons would play a role in the conflict, in which case would Putin dare use them, knowing that Poland is allied with the US, UK and France, all nations with their own nuclear stockpiles? Tell us what you think in the comments. Now go and check how Poland is preparing for full-scale war against Russia, or click this other video instead.